All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Esquivel, Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is Tuesday, January 5th, 2025. Happy New Year, everyone. And I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'll begin by introducing my fellow board colleagues. Joining us virtually this morning is Vice Chair Doreen Diadamo. In person, we have here Board Member Sean McGuire, Board Member Laurel Firestone, and Board Member Nicole Morgan. We're also joined by our executive staff, our Executive Director, Eric Oppenheimer, our two Chief Deputies, Jonathan Bishop and Karen Bogus. Our Chief Counsel is Michael Loffer. Our Clerk of the Board is Courtney Tyler, and assisting her today is Margie Argel and Elizabeth Carrillo. As you can see, this is a hybrid meeting with both web interface and in-person participation. If you're joining us virtually, you're either viewing us through our traditional webcast on YouTube Live or the Cali PA website. But if you intend on commenting on any of today's items, you need to be on the Zoom platform. There is a link at the top of the agenda and instructions on how to get onto the platform. But if you're having any challenges doing so, please do just email the clerk of the board at board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov, and she can help get you on the platform. Once you are on the platform, your camera will be off. You'll be on mute until it's your turn to speak on the item you've indicated. For everyone in the room, good morning. Good to see you, everyone. We're here in Sacramento in the California Environmental Protection Agency building. A few announcements for us here as well. Please do observe the exits. If we happen to have an emergency, we'll calmly file out to Cesar Chavez Plaza and await any further direction. And if you intend on commenting on any of today's items, there is a QR code there in the back and a laptop here at the side of the room to sign up. Once you are at the mic, please do introduce yourself and any affiliation you have. And lastly, please do silence any phones so that we can have an uninterrupted meeting and discussion this morning. As we customarily do, we begin our board meetings here with public forum, and I do believe we have a few public forum commenters. And so would first like to go to Regina Chicazola, be followed by Lauren Sweezy, Ray Tahir, and that should round out our public forum speakers this morning. First, I'd like to hear from Ms. Chicazola. Okay, sounds like Ms. Chicazola and Ms. Sweezy are both not on the platform, and so we will go to Ray Tahir.
Good morning, board members, and Happy New Year to you. Next slide, please. You'll be pleased to know that my presentation is very, very brief. To begin with, I have a concern about the board's denial of the City of Norwalk's administrative petition challenging the LA Ventura MS4 permit. As you may recall, at the December 4th, 2024 board meeting, I complained that the Office of Chief Counsel denied the city's petition based on its false authority that it may deem a petition rejected if it does not respond by the 91st day of the petition submittal. As I mentioned, state law requires state board to explain in writing why it rejected a petition, which did not happen. Mr. Loffer said that he would provide a written response to this concern. This has not happened. Please direct Mr. Loffer to provide a response before the next state board meeting. Next slide, please. Following up on fairness and due process. At the November 19th, 2024 board meeting, Mr. Loffer, in response to my concern regarding an apparent lack of compliance with Port of Cologne Section 13292 that addresses fairness and due process, claimed his office has provided guidance procedures, policy regulations to regional boards. I asked him to provide proof of this in the case of RB4, the LA Regional Board. He said that he would provide a response in writing. This has not happened either. Please direct Mr. Loffer to make good on his word and respond by the next board meeting. Next slide, please. Let's follow up on ex parte communication in just a second. As mentioned, Mr. Loffer invited me to meet with him to discuss ex parte communication issues. I agreed, but I insist that he respond to a list of questions prior to that meeting. I will send a list of questions to each of the board members. One thing I want to say about NPDES permitting and ex parte, since 1993, I was involved in the first MS4 permit and have applied for several types of NPDES permits. My guess is that Mr. Loffer was in high school and college in 1993. My point, I have more experience in this area than Mr. Loffer. I participated in writing portions of ROWD's report of waste discharges. I also participated in getting Senator Wright to adopt SB 965, which is intended to enable the public to communicate with board members outside of scheduled meetings and other meetings. I'm sorry, scheduled hearings and other meetings. Mr. Lawfer has a different opinion that will be settled once we meet. And that's about it. And I don't expect a rebuttal on this. And thank you very much for your time, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you as well, Mr. Tahir. Folks can obviously always avail themselves of public forum, but again, I think given the disagreements ultimately and the need to really actually try to unpack your concerns, I do recommend that you meet with Mr. Lawfer even prior to your list of questions being answered. I think it would be helpful because I think the back and forth in public forum at this point is kind of outlived its productive.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why I agreed to meet with Mr. Lawfer. That should end the back and forth on this, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it, Mr. Tahir. Good to hear from you. Happy New Year to you as well.
Same as you.
All right. I don't see. Okay. Lauren Sweezy. So our next commenter will be Lauren Sweezy.
Good morning, board members and staff. I'd like to make 3 points to you today. Number 1, we are not in a drought. The data that was used for the staff's finding of emergency drought did not include the above average November and December of 2024 Scott River flow or Scott Valley precipitation amount.
Ms. Weezy, I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt
Sure.
you here in public forum, but because you are referring to an item that we will be discussing later here in the board meeting, if you can hold on, I'd like to be able to take your comment in once we are at the Scott Shasta item, if that is okay.
Oh, that would be terrific. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, and I think Ms. Chicazola is not on the platform and may similarly have been looking to actually comment on the Scott Shasta item. So we will be getting to that here within due time and rather quickly here. Okay, I believe that wraps up public forum. Thank everyone again for coming to the board during public forum and presenting on items that are not currently agended before the board. That brings us now to our first item of board business, which is consideration of adoption.
But he asked me if I would speak later when it's.
I'll look to fellow board colleagues if there's anything they'd like to adjust or otherwise have comment on the minutes, and if not, open for a motion.
I'll make the motion to move the board meeting minutes. I'll second.
Thank you both. Ms. Tyler, can you please call a roll call vote?
Board Member Morgan.
Aye.
Board Member Firestone.
Aye.
Board Member McGuire.
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo.
Aye.
And Chair Escobar.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Board meeting minutes are adopted. And now brings us to item number 2, which is an uncontested item. And looking to see from the clerk, still uncontested, and hear from the dais if there's any desire for discussion. But do want to thank folks for the work on the item. And then otherwise, I think we're prepared for a motion.
Move to adopt item 2.
I'll second.
You both. Ms. Tyler, can you please call a roll call vote?
Board Member McGuire.
Aye.
Board Member Morgan.
Aye.
Board Member Firestone.
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo.
Aye.
And Chair Escobar.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. And the item is adopted. Next, we come to an informational item, which is an informational item on our current hydrologic conditions and response. Welcome, Ms. Bean up. Good to see you. Happy New Year.
Morning, board members. I'm Jessica Bean with the Division of Water Rights. I'm going to give you a brief update on the current hydrologic conditions and response today. If we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so taking a look at precipitation for the water year, this is as of January 4th. You can see on this map pretty clearly that the bluer colors kind of up in the north shows a lot more precipitation, very anomalously wet up north. And as you move down south, you get less and less precipitation and really relatively no precipitation down south. And so this is what we're seeing. We're looking at 115% of average for the state, but we are still relatively early in the water year. If we could go to the next slide, please. We can dig into this a little bit more when we look at these Sierra precipitation indexes. So this is the northern index. And if you take a look, I apologize, it's a little busy. There's a lot of water years on this, but the dark blue line is what we're looking at. And right now we're looking at 134% of average in the northern Sierra. Next slide, please. And then that jumps down pretty quickly to only 71% of average when you move into the San Joaquin area. And then if you go to the next slide, please, really about the same, it's about 70% of average in the Tulare Basin area. So, again, we're actually seeing a record-breaking contrast between the wet north and the dry south right now. So this is pretty unusual to have this this type. Let's look at the snowpack next, please. Slide. So our snowpack is following a very similar trend here. So up top in the north, you have 156% of normal. That's 56% of the April 1st average. Again, that dark blue line is what we're looking at, and the light blue area is the average. And then if you go into the central area, your percent of normal goes to 92%, down to 70% when you go into the southern area. And then again, really looking at about 106% of normal for the state. So we'll have to keep an eye on this and see what happens the closer we get to April 1st. All right, next slide, please. I'm going to shift slightly and just talk about temperature trends for a moment. So it's been unusually warm for most of California for about the past 3 months. That's what you're seeing here. So the redder colors are more above average temperatures. There are some pockets of very cool areas, mainly in the northern mountains and some of the southern coastal areas. But this is, having these wet and dry conditions and then the warmer temperatures is having some interesting impacts on some of the weather systems. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We've seen quite a few thunderstorms and thunderstorm activities and tornadoes. So this is an image that was shared by Dr. Daniel Swain recently from let me get the name here so I can tell you, from Craig Heaton took this picture. It's about 11 miles away from the Tehama Shasta border, where they had a pretty big tornado out there. So looking at kind of continuing on this pattern, if we look at the next slide, please. I'm sure folks have been hearing a lot about the wind storms that we're seeing down south. And this is an image of the jet stream model. And what's particularly interesting here is those arrows on the lines here are pointing down. So you're seeing the wind really coming down, and that purple is extremely high. You can see where it's hitting right there. So that's why there is a wind advisory in effect today through Thursday. Also, probably a lot of, fire weather, because we've had a couple of wet seasons followed by a dry season, and now dry, warm, windy conditions. So that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on there. All right, if we can go to the next slide, please. Looking at our major water supply reservoirs here, most are at or above average at this point. Folsom is slightly below, and Millerton is about 82%, but the rest are right about average. And then our final slide today, please, is just to remind folks of the annual diversion and use reporting that are due by the 1st of February. Again, these are for diversions from the past water year, and we are at about 19% compliance right now when I checked with staff late last week. So again, really encouraging people to get those reports in. They're very important. And that's what I have for you today.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Looking to fellow board colleagues if they have any questions or comments on the hydrologic report. Don't have any. Oh, Vice Chair, please.
Thank you, Ms. Bean, for the report as usual. It'd be great to get an update on the Colorado Basin. So just at the earliest opportunity that you have, if you could please update us on that situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Vice Chair. And not seeing further discussion, I do want to note, I did get an email. I think there are a couple folks that aren't currently on the Zoom platform that are looking to and to comment on the next item. So as we wrap up this informational item, I'm going to give ourselves just 10 minutes just to make sure that links go out and people are able to join the platform. And so thank you, Ms. Bean. Appreciate the update. Know that we're here in the middle of it. We'll see how this water year ends up shaping up, and just really appreciate the information. And let's give ourselves a quick 10-minute break just to make sure folks are able to get onto the platform before we transition to the Scott Shasta item. And so let's bring ourselves back here at 2:25 or 9:25 rather, and we'll get on to our next item. Thank you.
Testing, 1, 2. Do you think this would be louder?
Hello?
Testing,
That's-
testing. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, it's 9:25 and we can bring ourselves back. We're now transitioning to item number 4. We will hear from our Division of Water Rights regarding an amendment and readoption of an emergency regulation in the Scott Shasta River watersheds. I'd like to kick it off to folks here in the program.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel, board members of the, here today with us. My name is Philip Dutton. Am I speaking close enough? Thank you. Yes. My name is Philip Dutton, and I am a supervising engineer here at the Division of Water Rights. I'm a program manager. And with me today, we have Eric Ekdahl, Deputy Director for the Division of Water Rights, Aaron Ragazzi, Assistant Deputy Director, and Mariana Aui with our Office of the Chief Counsel. We are here to present an item on the proposed readoption of the emergency regulation for the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds. As part of this presentation, we'll also be joined with Crystal Robinson from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who will provide a brief update on the fisheries and other important information related to the proposed readoption of the regulation. Slide. Here's an outline of the items we'll cover in this presentation, starting with some background on recent related items and the board's authority to adopt an emergency regulation, followed by an update on the current conditions in the watershed. And during the term and other an update on the current conditions in the watershed and during the terms of the emergency regulation. Crystal from CDFW will then present. Then I'll highlight some items and comments during the staff's November outreach and engagement efforts and provide a summary of proposed updates to the current regulation, which include the change sheet. Finally, I'll cover comments on the proposed item and potential next steps. Slide. As a quick review of how we got here today, the board adopted the current emergency regulation that went into effect February 1st, 2024. It is set to expire on January 31st of this year. At its October 16th, 2024 board meeting, the board adopted a resolution regarding flow efforts in the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds. The resolution provided direction to staff on immediate and long-term flow-related efforts. Related to today's item, in the immediate term, staff were directed to solicit input on readoption of the emergency regulation and any changes that would be appropriate, as well as seeking alternatives to readoption. Board staff held a written comment period soliciting input on the potential readoption of the current emergency regulation, including those changes to the regulation and requesting proposals for alternatives to readoption. As part of this process, on November 12th, board staff held a public meeting to receive additional comments. No alternative were submitted, but staff did receive comments related to potential updates to the regulation. The regulation proposed for readoption today is the result of board's direction to staff and input received from interested parties. Next slide, please. Water Code 1058.5 allows the board to adopt emergency regulations to address a declared drought emergency. As noted in this slide, the governor has issued proclamations declaring and maintaining a drought emergency for the Klamath River watershed and noting the need to expeditiously mitigate the effects of drought conditions in the Klamath River. Next slide. The Klamath River watershed, which includes the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds, has been experiencing ongoing and long-term drought since 2000, with periods of extreme drought punctuated with periods of improved conditions. The fisheries of these watersheds have been impacted by these conditions, which are amplified under dry conditions when water resources are increasingly scarce and the fact that emergency minimum flows are not met without curtailments in most recent water years. These periods of extreme drought within a long-term drought and consistent low flow conditions have contributed to fishery declines in the Klamath watershed, which is an important fishery for the tribe's commercial and recreational fishing. The West Coast commercial salmon and recreational fishing has been completely shut down multiple times over the past few decades and was closed in 2024 for a second year in a row due to concerns related to fish stocks. At the same time, tribes have foregone their commercial subsistence and commercial fishing rights, which has detrimental impacts to the tribe's economy, community health, and culture. Fish impacted by the most recent severe drought conditions will be returning in the fall of 2025, specifically fish that outmigrated in 2022. Next slide. This morning, the flow at the USGS gauge at Fort Jones in the Scott River watershed was 2,390 cubic feet per second, or CFS, and the flow at the USGS gauge at Wairika in the Shasta River watershed was 393 CFS. These flows are above the minimum flow requirements of 200 CFS and 125 CFS for the Scott River and Shasta Rivers, respectively. Storage volumes at Dwinelle Reservoir in the Shasta River watershed was 25,200 acre-feet yesterday, approximately 50% of capacity. At this point in similar years, it was 8,000 acre-feet in 2023 and 11,500 acre-feet in 2024. This water year has started well, with an estimated snow water equivalent in the Scott and Shasta watersheds that is well above the average for this time of year. However, it should be noted that snowpack at this time of year is not a good indicator for the water year or of flows that will occur during the drier summer months. Most of the snowpack in the Klamath River watershed falls between January through March. The snowpack can be dynamic and change rapidly through the winter. Water availability for the Scott River and Shasta Rivers in summer of 2025 will depend greatly on the snowpack levels in April and May. Additionally, midwinter high flow events and localized flooding are not a reliable indicator of river flows in the drier months to come. For example, in February 2015, the Scott River watershed experienced high flow events peaking at 5,390 CFS, but flows in August of that year decreased to as low as 5 CFS. For these reasons, it is too early to predict water availability for the Scott and Shasta River watersheds later this year. Next slide, please. The emergency regulation establishes minimum in-stream flow requirements and provides authority to curtail water rights to meet those flow requirements. It also allows for groundwater local cooperative solutions that reduce groundwater diversions earlier in the season than would occur with curtailment. Many factors influence hydrology in these watersheds, including evapotranspiration rates that may be impacted by smoke from fires, planned and incidental groundwater recharge, such as projects completed by the Scott Valley Irrigation District, groundwater levels across the basin, and other diversions. As noted on this slide here, during the term of the emergency regulation, staff have observed higher stream flows, improved water temperatures, habitat availability, and groundwater levels, which benefit the fisheries. The emergency regulations have also accelerated staff's understanding of these watersheds, increased dialogue with key parties, promoted data sharing, and resulted in some lasting water efficiency improvements. Next slide. Looking at the Scott River, the top figure of this slide shows the time series of daily flows at the USGS Fort Jones gauge from September 2020 to present, along with the precipitation near the Fort Jones gauge, which is shown in the blue lines. The shaded red background shows when the emergency regulations have been in effect, and the red line shows the minimum in-stream flow requirements of those regulations. The figure on the bottom is the time series of average Scott Valley groundwater elevation data as provided by UC Davis. As you can see, the groundwater levels fluctuate over the seasons, but there is an overall increasing trend year to year. As of November 2024, fall groundwater levels are at the highest level recorded in the past 5 years. These elevated groundwater levels may be the result of a variety of factors, including curtailments and groundwater local cooperative solutions. Improved groundwater levels have contributed to increases in in-stream flows with less precipitation, as seen in August of 2024. Examples of recent improved flow conditions relative to similar amounts of precipitation in 2022 occurred in 2023 and 24. Specifically, on December 7th, 2023, flows at the Fort Jones gauge reached over 250 CFS after precipitation of 4.56 inches. Similarly, in fall of 2024, flows exceeded the 60 CFS minimum requirement in November with less than 2 inches of cumulative rainfall. This is a noticeable improvement compared to 2022 when similar rainfall yielded significantly lower flows. Slide. This figure represents the time series from October 2017 to present for daily flows at the Wairika gauge in the Shasta River watershed. Flows are in blue, and precipitation near the Wairika Gauge in the Shasta is shown in green. The shaded red areas again show where the emergency regulation was in effect, and the red line shows the emergency minimum flows. As shown in this graphic, curtailments under the emergency regulation have been very effective in maintaining higher flows during the dry season, better supporting the needs of the salmonid fisheries in the Shasta River. Next slide, please. As you know, those participating in the Groundwater Local Cooperative Solution Program during the 2024 irrigation season were required to meter their groundwater diversions and report their water use. This was a big undertaking, and staff have identified multiple areas of improvement, including the timely installation of groundwater meters, as well as timely collection and reporting of water use measurements. These are items that staff will be working to improve in the coming irrigation season if the emergency regulation is readopted. During the 2024 irrigation season, staff received proposals that covered more than 15,000 acres in the Scott Valley, which is more than 85% of the groundwater irrigated acreage. This slide summarizes meters in place in 2024 and meters proposed for future irrigation seasons. State Water Board financial assistance has been underused, and continues to be available for metering equipment. Staff encourage the agricultural community to take advantage of available funding for groundwater metering, which can also support their agricultural operations. Slide, please. This slide provides an example of how metering is used to understand applied water. In this example, the applicant's estimated water use was 159 inches per acre, which would require applied water rates of 109 inches per acre or less under the 30% local cooperative solution. After installing a meter, the measured water use was actually 44 inches per acre, approximately 70% less than the initial estimated baseline. Metering allows the collection of accurate water use information, which is critical to establishing baseline water usage and supports improved water use assumptions that may be helpful for modeling or other efforts aimed at meeting the diverse water needs of the watersheds. Additional benefits of metering identified by UC Davis include increased irrigation efficiency, identification of leaks and system losses, and reduced overall water pumping and associated energy costs. Next slide, and we'll transfer over to Crystal.
Good morning, Board Chair and members of the board. My name is Crystal Robinson. I'm the Klamath Watershed Program Supervisor, and I'll be presenting today on behalf of the department. Next slide. I'd like to begin with a brief summary of this presentation. I'll first review the trustee role of the department and then present an update on the status of fish in the Scott and Shasta this year. I will also discuss some of the information we have regarding the fish response to dam removal conditions that were experienced this fall during migration. Next, I will present information related to the current emergency in-stream flow recommendations and the conditions we're seeing on the ground for habitat and fish in both rivers. I'll then provide a background on CDFW's role in local cooperative solution determinations of equal or better using French Creek as a case study. Next slide. As trustee for California's Fish and Wildlife Resources, CDFW has jurisdiction over the conservation, protection, and management of fish, wildlife, native plants, and habitat necessary for biologically sustainable populations of those species. Next slide, please. Scott and Shasta Fisheries Update. Next. The Scott and Shasta rivers are currently being monitored for adult salmonid escapement. CDFW operates video weirs at the mouth of the Shasta and at approximately River Mile 18 on the Scott. Carcass and red surveys are occurring with our cooperators both upstream and downstream of the video weirs to collect biological information as well as spatial distribution. All estimates are preliminary. We currently have 599 Chinook salmon through the Scott. This is below the 1978 to 2023 mean value of 4,758 spawners. We will be revising this estimate to include data collected in the 18 miles downstream of the video weir. We are expecting a low return of Chinook salmon this year and the closure of the commercial and the recreational fishery was a reflection of that. As for coho salmon, approximately 706 have passed through the counting station so far. The 2007 to 2023 mean for this species is 716 spawners. This brood year returned to spawn in the fall of 2021 and was 852 adults for comparison. This brood year of coho salmon is also the first to have completed a full life cycle within the Scott and Shasta emergency regulation. The Shasta River has had 4,944 Chinook salmon enter the watershed to date. This is near the 2007 to 2023 mean value of 6,554 spawners. As for coho salmon, the Shasta has a 22-year mean of 95 spawners and a 9-year mean of 46 spawners. To date, we've had 41 coho salmon through the Shasta River video counting station. Steelhead escapement for the 24-25 season will be reported in the end of season report, and we have no preliminary estimates available at this time. Next slide. Last January, removal of the remaining 3 hydroelectric dams on the Klamath River began. Coffer Dam breaches started in late August, and the final breach of the Iron Gate Coffer Dam occurred during the first week of October. The river experienced several events of increased suspended sediment with associated decreases in dissolved oxygen during this large restoration project. CDFW worked with basin fishery managers on assessment of water quality, fish health conditions, and management options throughout the process. We know that fish have evolved with sediment. Adults are equipped to quickly seek out better water quality conditions, and the tributaries to the Klamath during dam removal were offering refuge to those conditions. We also saw changes to main stem water temperatures when compared to historic trends. This was an expected change and predicted in post-dam temperature modeling. Water quality conditions in the main stem created what we believe was a potential shift to the migration run timing of salmon in the Scott and Shasta, and I will describe this more on the next slide. Next slide. CDFW's fish counting station has been collecting data on both rivers for the last 22 years. We provide weekly reports on both adult and juvenile population estimates as migration and emigration is annually occurring from the Scott and Shasta. In that report, we include the graph you can see on the right of this slide that compares the cumulative in-season total to the minimum and maximums of the 20-year data set, as well as the mean and the median. This particular example is for the 2024 Shasta River Chinook salmon. This information was used to determine the migration timing shifts listed for each species on this slide. You can see a clear shift in timing for Chinook entering the Shasta when compared to the mean and median. Coho timing appeared to shift by approximately 2 weeks from that mean and median. The Scott River timing shift for Chinook salmon was about 1.5 to 2 weeks later than the mean median, but the coho salmon migration timing did not appear to shift from that median mean. CDFW plans to continue these monitoring efforts, and future data will help inform our understanding of migration timing under a new baseline with the lower 4 dams on the Klamath now removed. Next slide. Next, I will present some of the results on implementing the current emergency in-stream flow recommendations in the Scott and Shasta for the past 3 years. We conducted fish surveys at summer base flows, which is after the snowmelt period in June or July through the start of fall rain. We also conducted surveys in both Shasta and Scott River reaches since we have good landowner access there, and our partners are conducting surveys and providing information in other locations of both watersheds. The canyon flow gauges on both rivers are also the minimum in-stream flow compliance point and therefore important locations to evaluate fish response to these flow targets. Next slide. The Scott River Canyon is the lower 21 miles of the watershed downstream of the USGS Fort Jones Gauging Station. This area is diverse in habitat features and annually has spawning and rearing by salmonids. First, for species clarity, we refer to juvenile trout as omicus since we are unable to determine if they are steelhead or resident trout at this life stage. The last 2 years, we conducted an adult dive survey of the entire canyon and are now annually identifying adult steelhead as well as spawning adult Pacific lamprey present in early August in the Scott River Canyon. Next slide. For the past 3 years, CDFW has been conducting base flow fish surveys in the Shasta River as well. We have identified presence of Omicus all 3 years in the canyon. In the last 2 years, crews increased survey efforts and have documented Chinook salmon residing in the canyon through base flow. In 2022 and 2023, CDFW surveyed the Big Springs complex and documented Omicus but no salmonids. In 2024, we focused our efforts in the canyon due to concerns over the base flow threshold. However, the department funded the Karuk Fisheries Program to survey the CDFW Big Springs Ranch. Karuk Fisheries staff surveyed through the end of June and identified only Omicus at base flow. The last Chinook salmon seen in Big Springs was in March. No coho juvenile salmon have been identified on snorkel surveys in either the Shasta Canyon or the Big Springs complex for the past 3 years of these surveys under the regulation. Next slide. After seeing Chinook salmon rearing every week in the canyon, we decided to seek out microhabitats that may be supporting them during times of day when the water temperatures are high, acknowledging thermal refuge may exist. Survey crews noted deep pools with little visibility, and we tested the theory that they could be potentially stratifying. Water pool stratification is the process by which a body of water forms distinct layers with different properties such as density, temperature, salinity, or oxygen. We were able to instrument a few pools with temperature probes at the end of August, and we did see a difference between the top and the bottom of the pool noted on the graph depicted here. Additionally, we surveyed an area known as Salmon Heaven. This habitat is complex, containing several side channels and cold water seeps. The map on the left of this slide depicts some of the important microhabitat features noted by crews in that area. We visited the site at 50 CFS and noted there was no connection between the main stem and this side channel. We revisited at 70 CFS later in September and found the side channel and the cold water seeps were accessible to the main stem fish at that flow. Next slide. We wanted to discuss why CDFW feels that 50 CFS in the Shasta Canyon is the right minimum drought flow target. First is our reliance on the best available science. We have a citable peer-reviewed flow study specific to the Shasta Canyon. The McBain and Trush 2014 Shasta River Canyon study recommended an in-stream flow need of greater than or equal to 50 CFS for a dry year scenario from July 1st through September 14th. Given the volcanic spring system of the Shasta watershed and the stable base flows, we relied on the dry year scenario flow target as our recommendation during the drought regulation process. We also have evidence through implementation of the current emergency regulation of temperature reductions documented by the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, as well as salmonid presence documented by CDFW throughout base flow and identification of cold water habitat features. To elaborate, the Regional Water Board staff analyzed water temperatures for the 2022 summer season during implementation of the regulation. Analysis showed reduction to Shasta Canyon water temperatures during curtailment of high-quality spring water from junior water right holders. Additionally, CDFW Shasta Canyon fish surveys documented salmonid presence through the summer during regulation implementation, as I spoke of on the previous slides, for the past 3 years. On the next slide, I will talk about the flow fluctuations experienced during base flow and our concerns as to protections for fish. Next slide. These 3 USGS Shasta at Wairika hydrographs depict the fluctuations in river flows experienced during the implementation of the emergency regulation from 2022 through 2024. The dark red line on each of these graphs is the 50 CFS flow minimum for the Shasta River Canyon from July 1st through September 14th. Flow drops below 50 are of concern to the department, as this is our bare minimum needed to sustain the fisheries through drought, according to the best available science. We are concerned that a lower flow threshold is not scientifically justified, and implementation will potentially experience these same sort of flow fluctuations, resulting in even lower flows for the Shasta River during this critical time of year for fish. Next slide. Next, I will present information regarding the continued use of local cooperative solutions. Next slide, please. Under the current regulation, surface water irrigators or groups of surface water irrigators can submit to CDFW a local cooperative solution as a means for reducing water use or to preserve minimum flows, or to provide other fishery benefits in lieu of curtailment. CDFW carefully evaluates each of these proposals individually to determine if the LCS proposed is equal or better to the in-stream benefits realized during curtailment. During the summer of 2024, CDFW worked with the Scott and Shasta Watermaster District on French Creek to develop a sub-tributary-wide LCS. This is an example where negotiations resulted in a slightly low flow threshold in exchange for landowner access to evaluate habitat and fish usage through an area of river that historically was isolated pools through base flow, holding thousands of juvenile coho salmon. There were flow benefits in this LCS over the pre-regulation baseline, and we also recognize that the flows negotiated may not have been equal or better to French Creek flows under curtailment. However, we wanted to understand the condition of habitat and salmonids under a 3 CFS flow threshold in September, which we've never been able to evaluate, and this knowledge was considered a benefit to the fishery. CDFW will continue to evaluate LCSs in a way that allows for evaluations of reduced water use, preserving minimum flows, and other fishery benefits, recognizing the flexibility within the regulation for CDFW determinations of equal or better. Next slide. Thank you for the time to present this information today. And in closing, the Governor's California Salmon Strategy for a Hotter, Drier Future directs work to begin on the establishment of minimum in-stream flows for the Scott and Shasta rivers, as well as to work with local groups on solutions and options to incentivize the reduction of surface water diversions and groundwater pumping in these basins. And so CDFW will continue to work with the State Water Board staff and local partners to support the development of baseline minimum flow requirements in both of these rivers. We also recognize that LCSs may be a valuable tool for future consideration at meeting these thresholds. Additionally, we are looking forward to collaborating with all partners in both watersheds and providing information on the scientific basis report. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. To the next slide, please. There we are. All right, we'll come back with highlights from our comments that we received during November 2024. As a reminder, staff held a public meeting on November 12th and solicited comments through November 20th on the potential readoption of the emergency regulation, suggested changes to the regulation if it is readopted, and any alternatives thereto. No formal alternatives to readoption of the emergency regulation were provided, but agricultural interest expressed a desire to continue discussions on the potential for alternative flows during the summer in the Shasta River watershed. Staff have proposed changes to the regulation to provide for such flexibility as noted later in this presentation. Commenters representing the agricultural and environmental communities expressed an interest in establishing flow targets at key tributaries or other locations in the watershed. Staff are not recommending changes to the regulation at this time due to a lack of flow targets and a lack of appropriately calibrated gauges in the watershed to support the implementation of those types of flow requirements. The potential for flow requirements at key tributaries is something board staff plan to explore further as part of the long-term flow efforts in both watersheds. Water diverters have also expressed concern relating to the timing of curtailments, noting that curtailments have been implemented with a buffer. Curtailments are initiated or lifted based on consideration of available information to meet the goal established in the regulation of meeting and sustaining the minimum flow requirements. Staff notes that a buffer may be necessary in some instances, especially in the Scott River during the summer, when flows generally continue to decline without the ability to rebound if curtailments are implemented retroactively. The Shasta River generally provides for more direct management and coordination because of the Watermaster services available. Staff will continue to work to simplify curtailment notices and to notify diverters as early as possible of potential curtailments, as well as encouraging diverters to continue to coordinate their diversions to limit the need for curtailments and to provide the maximum benefit for the agricultural community and the fisheries. One final comment to highlight is ongoing concern related to lack of enforcement. Water Board enforcement staff have been active in these watersheds, and enforcement actions are regularly posted to the board's websites. Next slide, please. Proposed changes to the existing regulation, if readopted, are summarized on this and the following slide. One set of changes adds this flexibility to the metering requirement for groundwater wells associated with a groundwater local cooperative solution. The current emergency regulation requires metering at each well. This proposed change would allow for metering of wells or metering at the point of application, such as metering at a pivot irrigation system. Other minor changes to the groundwater local cooperative solution program include documenting metered water, use at a weekly rather than daily interval, possible acceptance of late applications with valid justification, additional clarity related to the notice associated with inspections and the type of information that support compliance inspections. Additional proposed changes include clarification on CDFW equal or better determinations based on experience gained through implementation of such local cooperative solutions. As a reminder, there remains financial assistance available for metering equipment. Slide, please. Additional proposed changes allow CDFW to propose alternative flows in the Shasta River for limited terms to evaluate for equal or better fishery conditions. Similar to previous readopted regulations, proposed updates to Section 875 provide for continuation of existing curtailment orders, certifications, petitions, and approvals under the proposed regulation. Proposed updates to Section 875.2 would provide clarification and emphasize that the use of water under the minimum human health and safety exception for firefighting is allowed. Proposed updates to Section 875.7 provide for CDFW to notify the board of the need to limit inefficient livestock watering diversions when additional flow is needed to support fish passage for migration. Proposed updates to Section 875.9 would remove outdated penalty amounts. Slide, please. Staff released a preliminary draft version of the emergency regulation on December 20th, 2024. The draft regulation was released for public comment as part of the agenda on December 26th, 2024. 3 comment letters or emails were received and are summarized on this slide and the following. As previously mentioned, the proposed emergency regulation provides for CDFW to propose alternative flows in the Shasta River. Such alternative flows were limited to a maximum of 2 weeks in the proposed regulation released on the 26th. After reviewing public comments from the Siskiyou County Farm Bureau, noted on this slide, the proposed regulation text has been updated via change sheet number 1 to provide for alternative flows for a limited period of time rather than a maximum of 2 weeks. Highlights of comments from the California Farm Bureau are summarized on this slide and include comments received that question the board's authority to readopt the regulation in light of improved hydrologic conditions, note that there are broader issues affecting the fishery decline in agriculture and these watersheds, and recognize the need to work together to solve these challenges. Next slide, please. Similar to comments received in November, the Environmental Law Foundation, Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations, and Institute for Fishery Resources comments emphasize the importance of readopting the emergency regulation, recognizing the economic, cultural, and ecosystem importance of salmon, while also noting the need for long-term flow regulations. They also reiterate comments in previous letters, noting a need to tighten extraction limits for groundwater local cooperative solutions, specifically looking at the graduated cessation option, the need for tributary-specific flow requirements to ensure connectivity to the main stems, and improve the transparency of local cooperative solutions. In addition, there was concern over new language, adding information as a potential element of CDFW's equal or better determinations, noting that the board's existing information authority, the need to focus on meeting flow requirements, and a concern that it could encourage withholding of information. It should be noted that this provision of the regulation provides CDFW, not the board, with the ability to consider benefits of information that may be gained through a local cooperative solution, such as fisheries-specific information. It does not limit or impact the board's authority to pursue information through an information order. Such benefits were part of the French Creek local cooperative solution that CDFW discussed at the October meeting and earlier in this presentation. This additional language seeks to clarify the regulation based on implementation of the regulation. Slide, please. The fiscal impacts. These were calculated in a similar manner to last year, with the fiscal impacts estimated for 3 different flow forecast scenarios: an expected range scenario based on the state of flows in October 24, an extreme drought scenario, and an above average scenario. The fiscal analysis is conservative in that it addresses uncertainty with assumptions that increase fiscal impact. Under the board's direction from October, staff are working towards a much more refined approach. The State Water Board estimates the total cost to all state and local agencies due to the proposed emergency regulation as $1.56 million for the expected range scenario, estimated $2.3 million for the extreme drought scenario, and approximately $374,000 for the above average scenario. As shown on the slide, the estimated costs from the agencies are focused on 4 categories: revenue losses for municipal water supply agencies, revenue losses for non-municipal water supply agencies, county and state agricultural tax revenue losses, and reporting costs. The estimate of fiscal costs from the different agencies are reported under different hydrologic scenarios, and the reporting costs remain the same for each of the scenarios. Next slide, please. Next steps. If the proposed regulation is adopted by the board today, the next step would be to submit the regulation and record to the Office of Administrative Law, or OAL, for its 10-day review period. The regulation would become effective following OAL approval and filing with the Secretary of State, such that the regulation will go into effect 10 days after submittal to OAL. Accordingly, we would anticipate the regulation will go into effect in January 2025. Slide. On this slide are the ways to stay up to date on the Scott Shasta information and contact information for staff. This concludes the staff presentation, and we're happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Really appreciate the presentation and just the ongoing effort in the watershed. I know the work here doesn't come without tension, but I've appreciated the balanced approach that I know we've attempted to take, and ultimately the flexibility that's been built into this version of the emergency reg, which again, we're trying to iterate here, continue to learn together collectively, and think that there's benefit in testing some of the hypotheses that I know that folks on the ag side are wanting, insofar as trying to go below these belly scraping flows, these minimum stream flows. And so just appreciate the flexibility that was built into this version of the emergency reg to be able to explore some of those and continue to work with folks here in the watershed. Looking to fellow board colleagues, if they have any questions or comments off the bat. We have a number of commenters that we can continue to hear from. And seeing Board Member McGuire, please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation and all the work on this effort. I know it's this is our third. Is this the 3rd year? Is that right, or is this the 4th year? Thank you for, yeah. To that point, right? It's been a lot, and this watershed has been through a lot, and the drought has had, did have and continues to have significant impacts on the fisheries health. And so that's not lost on me, and I think that's why we're here today to talk about that and to be ready for the year that comes ahead here as we watch. I know we had an item just a little bit ago on hydrologic conditions updates, and we saw a map that showed the precipitation, the rainfall and the snowpack in the northern part of the state, and it has been a better year so far than we saw in the initial years of this emergency regulation. And so that's promising, encouraging. I think we all hope for a wetter year, and I think that would make it easier on everyone. I think it'll make it easier on the fisheries as well as the water users in the watershed, because certainly they've been impacted by this as well. And so I was just on that, I appreciate the detailed updates on the fisheries and the state and what we know, especially with the changes in the Klamath, and the watershed's going through a lot of changes now, and time will tell what those impacts will be. Hopefully very beneficial to the fish. But I'm reacting a little bit to the slide on the fiscal impacts to water users, and I wasn't actually at the October board meeting where there was a board resolution adopted to take steps forward on the long-term science work and potential next steps in the watershed. But I was just wondering, I appreciate the dollars estimates, and I know it's difficult to put, quantify the impacts to water users, but I mean, this estimate focuses on impacts to state and local agencies and the water suppliers themselves, but doesn't really get into the impacts as directly to agriculture itself. So I was wondering if could you just sort of share a little bit more about what we know there, because this is the fourth year going into this, and it's not lost on me that every year that we have curtailments, that we run into this situation, there are impacts to agriculture and to the water users. And so for me, just understanding that balance and understanding those trade-offs that we're making is helpful to this process.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing the slide back up. I do think it is helpful in noting that third bullet under estimated costs is something that's not required by the emergency reg process, but something that has been added, I think, a couple EREG events previous to this one at the request of a board member, so that we could get a better handle on what the impacts might be to the local community. And so that third bullet is really us trying to figure out what the impact is on a more local scale as a result of the implementation of the regulations. It's not great. We welcome new information from parties, specific information on water supply and fiscal impacts that growers have experienced in these communities. We haven't gotten specific information, but we do welcome that. Also, I want to note, as part of the longer term process in the October 16th resolution, there is direction for a broader economic analysis, and that would include impacts to the agricultural community as well as the fisheries community, but digging in a lot deeper than we're able to do with an emergency regulation in the time frame we have here.
I appreciate that. And I acknowledge that this is a quick decision that we have to make. And, it's not lost on me how significant this is and that we do need to be prepared for the year ahead. And just the acknowledgement that there's going to be continued work in this area. And for me, it helps to see these numbers and have some sort of estimate. But what I'm not able to tell from this is kind of, these are big numbers to me, certainly, but I don't really know how significant those are to the folks who rely on this as a way of life, right, and using this water. So it's kind of a order of magnitude, relative scale. It's hard to tell.
Right, and it is highly variable. I will note that the impact to some growers who already have best management practices in place may be less than those who are having to either fallow land or implement new efficiencies associated with their growing. And also pasture is, I think, impacted more so than like alfalfa and grain because of its water demand needs. So it is highly variable, I think, across both watersheds and with specific growers.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, agree, board member, that having at least these numbers is helpful here as we make this decision, but looking forward to that more thorough economic analysis, because there are impacts here ultimately to tribes, to the fisheries, that, as we do our balancing and we look at numbers like this to understand the impact, it's important to have that whole more complete picture. But at least here having this cursory data is at least helpful here as we contemplate what are these impacts financially, but then also understanding the benefits as well. Looking to see if there's anything further from the dais. Board Member Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. It's more of a statement, a comment. Just referring back to the timing of curtailments, and there's a mention of the need of a buffer, especially within the Scott watershed, and understanding that you may not be able to wait until you actually reach the the set limit before sending out a curtailment notice. And so, we've had discussions about this and just really want to encourage staff to really communicate with the water users in the agricultural community to make sure that we are forecasting early and where there can be a better understanding, because understand that you're also you're looking at forecasts, you're looking at, hey, is it going to rain anytime soon, what size the storm may be. There's a lot of variables that go into whether or not you're looking at sending out a curtailment notice. They're really working with the communities so that they can make early management decisions, and they can better plan for if there is going to be a curtailment. Understanding that the goal is that we don't dip underneath that number and that we are staying on target, and we don't want to have large dips and then have to try to regain those losses. And we find that balance. And so just really, for me, just communication is key, and just really making sure that we're working together to manage the watershed and really helping those who are local to manage themselves so that they can understand, hey, the curtailment is probably going to be coming, so let's go ahead and take specific actions. And then that way the notice doesn't have to necessarily go out. And, we can work together in order to make sure that we are reaching the common goals.
Thank you. Staff remain committed to trying to communicate on the ground conditions in the watershed and potential actions that may be taken. It is very dynamic in these watersheds. And so even at a staff level, we are, looking at all of the information, checking in before we send something, because we also don't want to issue something if it's not needed. So we remain committed to continue to have that communication and improve it moving forward.
Thank you, and I appreciate that emphasis, board member. I know, I think it was last year, there were wildfire conditions going on, and I think we paused on actually issuing a curtailment so as to not kind of add to the burden of work that folks were in the middle of trying to respond to that. So appreciate that flexibility and agree with the board member that just need to continue to be communicative, and here trying to be just incredibly transparent in what we're doing, the rationale, and hopefully communicating it well into the watershed. So really appreciate that. Thank you. Vice Chair.
Thank you. And I just want to take this opportunity to reiterate what I think's already been said, that really looking forward to the longer term interim flows and kicking off that process so that we can obtain more information that Board Member McGuire was talking about, and Chair, you as well, just looking for the opportunity to receive that information so that we can have the tools to better balance. It's not lost on me that we're not just looking at wetter conditions than in previous years, but there's actually been some localized flooding, in particular in the Scott Valley. And so these are issues that I think that, for me, looking at whether or not this is an ongoing drought emergency after we've had numerous years that are above normal, in particular this year. And so I really do pause before considering the approach of, again, implementing this emergency regulation. But I'm all ears and look forward to hearing what the comments are today. But just do want to note that with each year, I think that what we're adopting is improving. And so looking for more flexibility, as well as the opportunity to do some testing on temperature and different flow levels in the Shasta Valley, in particular in the Canyon Reach, which I know has been an issue for some in the ag community each year that this comes before us. So I'm excited about that opportunity, but at the same time, a bit hesitant on the readoption. And year after year, this just doesn't seem to be the right tool to be using. So I do look forward to the opportunity to pivot to the long-term interim flows and utilizing this process and the additional flexibility and what we've learned, this year and in previous years, as we pivot to the other process.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Definitely see it as a continuum of an effort, and this yearly adoption here at this point, feeding into that longer term effort. So agree on those points and appreciate comments. To see if there's anything further from the dais, and not seeing, then we can go to our commenters. And first, we'd like to call up Regina Chicazola, who followed by Lauren Sweezy, then Nick Jocelyn, Angelina Cook, and then David Webb.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Good morning. Good to see you. Thank you. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Well, first, I just wanted to express support for the emergency regulations. I do understand that it's not really the best method to move forward with protecting the salmon and making sure there are in-stream flows. But it is the tool that we have right now, being that we haven't finished, or even we have just started the process to establish what the flows need to be to start restoring salmon within the Scott and Shasta River watersheds. With that, I do have a few concerns with the plan as proposed. I do agree with Fish and Wildlife Service that the baseline flow of 50 should be considered the belly scraping flow within the Shasta River watershed. I think we really need to look at whether or not habitat is available and not just whether or not what seems like a cool flow. Anyway, so I think we need to listen to the experts when it comes to what those belly scraping flows need to be. I also think we need to make sure that we're doing everything possible to protect the groundwater. To see the chart that groundwater levels are up, it does show that these emergency regulations, even though they're belly scraping and not enough, are working and are helping. And I hope that restoration efforts do move forward, because truthfully, localized flooding, if there are floodplains available, can be very helpful to recharging the groundwater. I do think that the early and often notifications are really important so the ag community can plan ahead, but also so that the public knows what's happening. And then on the issues of trading information for flow, I understand why that approach was used, but I think it sets a little bit of a dangerous precedent. We're all in this together, and providing information and making sure that we can make solid plans that work for everyone is just really important. And to say that, okay, well, now you don't have to make sure to do your part because you allowed us to gather information, I think is not a good path forward. So that's my only real concern, because I think we've seen that when there is opportunities for abuse within some of these watersheds, they can actually happen. Sorry, I was making tea. And we saw that before with the early the early cooperative solution process, and we have gotten better on that. But I don't want to be in a situation where we're trading information for flow and people start taking advantage of that. With that, I think we need to look at certain situations when it comes to temperatures also. I'm really concerned that we're still having such terrible flows and temperatures coming out of the Dwinell Reservoir. So I think when we really look into the long-term planning, we need to make sure that it's not just, oh, well, they're a senior water right holder, so they don't have to participate, but actually look at where in the watershed we are, engage in different parts of the watershed. And that is somewhere where I've agreed with the agricultural community somewhat. It can't just be one flow gauge we're looking at and then putting all of the burden within the people that are close to that flow gauge. We need to look at habitat throughout watersheds. But I think this is better than what we've had. I just really think that looking at metering, enforcement, and then making sure that there's not room for abuse, but also that people know what's coming and when so that they can plan well. is important. I really look forward to working with you on the long-term solutions, because I do think it's going to be really important so that everyone can plan ahead. And I know that like this doesn't feel like the best path forward, but I like to remind the board that before we're looking at minimum in-stream flows and emergency flows, that we were having rivers go dry even in good years. And just because it's rained for the last month does not mean that it's going to continue to rain. And we do need to replenish the groundwater in these watersheds, and we do need to look at the needs of the salmon in the long term. And if we cut from what we've done now, we could lose whole age classes of salmon again and have everything that we've done turn out for naught. So please move forward. Please make sure to notify the community of what to expect, and please make sure that there is metering and enforcement, and that we're looking at different compliance points within the watershed. And also, thank you so much for your work to make sure everyone can engage in these hearings, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Ms. Chicazola. Appreciate those points and comments, and agree that there is an opportunity for us to get more granular as we continue to do this work, not just relying on single points of compliance, but really having a better understanding of the watershed. So appreciate your point in common with some of the ag folks out there that are looking for the same. So thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Lauren Sweezy, be followed by Nick Jocelyn, then Angelina Cook, David Webb, and Cody Phillips.
Good morning again, board members and staff. I'd like to make 3 points to you today. And in addition to that, I do want to say that I appreciate the information that I've heard this morning from other agencies and folks. And I think all of us have something valuable to state and collectively put together in a package. But I don't agree with everything that was said. So with that in mind, I'd like to bring these 3 points to you. The first one is we are not in a drought. The data that was used for the staff's finding of emergency drought did not include the above average November and December 2024 Scott River flow or Scott Valley precipitation amounts. The U.S. Drought Monitor states that the watershed is not in a drought. The drought.gov website states that we are extremely wet for the past 60 days. This updated water data inclusion needs to be done before your decision, or the factual basis for this year's emergency water situation in our watershed is incorrect. Number 2, the 2024 Chinook spawning survey showed very low and very delayed numbers of returning adults in the Scott River. And I do this salmon survey, so I saw this firsthand. The Scott River had suffered flows for healthy access to the usual spawning locations for over 50 miles of this October-November spawning season. This year's spawner impact cannot be blamed on irrigators in Scott Valley. The delay and low return could certainly have resulted from the overlap at the same time of unhealthy water in the Klamath River caused from sediment storage released by the dam removal. The resulting heavy sediment load was shown by USGS monitoring to have severely polluted the river down to at least Orleans during the upstream migration to the Scott. Excessive sediment load is documented to cause lower oxygen content, deep silt deposits throughout the river bottom, and impacts on salmon's gills and upstream navigation. This serious main stem Klamath River sediment impact is external to the conditions of the Scott River and beyond our local control. It shows that the Scott River water conditions are not solely determined of salmon returns. However, salmon population returns to our watershed are used as by your agency and others as the primary measure of success for assessing the need for regulations. And the third point, lastly, the rush for this regulation seems unnecessary. It's clear we have sufficient flows this year. We are not in a drought, and we have so much water that we have flood watch at our barn doors. What is the rush for this e-reg to continue just to decide in a non-drought year? The Water Board's emergency drought regulation requirement for the 2025 season is very unnecessary. It's time for a pause on this action by the board. There is no emergency for the Chinook or coho salmon in the Scott River, currently or anticipated. And thank you so much for a moment to give you my thoughts.
And really appreciate those thoughts and engagement, Ms. Sweezy. Concerns heard for sure. And I do know that it is not just the hydrology that's dictating the readoption of the emergency curtailment, but the ongoing impacts, the tail, if you will, from drought conditions. But your concerns are certainly heard, and appreciate your engagement here in the process, and agree with you, as you said here at the top, that our decision making, all of this work is best informed when we have everyone at the table and everyone's voices. So certainly, again, concerns heard, and thank you again for being here and being part of this discussion. I don't believe Nick Jocelyn is on the platform, so we will next go to Angelina Cook, be followed by David Webb.
Good morning and Happy New Year. My name is Angelina Cook, and I am commenting today on behalf of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. And we enthusiastically urge the Water Board to extend emergency and stream flow requirements in 2025. Today, I would like to focus on the economic implications of salmon extinction and the fiscal analysis. Vivian Hellewell with the PCFFA recently circulated a letter submitted to the Water Board signed by the Karuk tribe and many here today in 2013, requesting in-stream flow requirements in the Scott. How is it that this discussion began over 15 years ago, and we are still hobbling along with bare minimum belly scraping flows enforced on an expensive annual basis? The only response that makes sense is that the state is underestimating the gravity of salmon extinction and overestimating the value of ag irrigation. Aside from the cultural devastation of salmon extinction, the economic impacts of river degradation are also dire and extensive. With commercial, tribal, and recreational salmon fishing prohibited in 3 of the past 5 years, coastal fishing communities have suffered intensely. Fishing guides and those who provide accommodations for recreational fishermen in coastal and rural communities have also suffered. And then we have the more externalized costs of dietary health impacts to tribal and non-tribal residents without access to the most high-quality animal protein that is indigenous to this area, which will result in a variety of costs down the road. In your fiscal analysis, in addition to studying the risks to the agricultural community, it is imperative to include the extreme losses to fishing, recreational, rural tourism, and tribal communities. It's also crucial to remember that crop alternatives exist for the ag community, but there are no substitutes for salmon. In closing, I want to reiterate that the Shasta and Scott rivers are constantly in a state of drought, not because of climate changes and the precipitation received, but because of the state's overallocated water rights and under-regulated water uses. Please restore balance to the Klamath Basin and improve equity in our communities by doing everything in your power to replenish flows that will result in a harvestable surplus on a permanent basis. Thank you very much for your time today. And I look forward to hopefully feeding into the economic information over the next year that will lead to more permanent regulations in the coming year. Thanks again.
Thank you as well for your time, Ms. Cook. Appreciate your comments and engagement here, and looking forward to that continued engagement into the long term as well. So thank you. Next, I'd like to call up David Webb, be followed by Cody Phillips, and then Jeff Eisenberg.
Thank you very much for the opportunity again to speak to you. And I really appreciate that you are again considering protecting in-stream flows for these two very important rivers for another year, and also for your early initiation of the long-term process leading to a more permanent solution. I think all of us here, doesn't matter which side of this we're on, find the reliance on emergency drought proclamation at best really, really regrettable. But it's the only tool you've got, and it's the only tool we've got. And when one looks at in-stream flows in both rivers, it really doesn't matter how much rainfall we get in terms of in-stream flows. Every year is a drought year. And the only times that has changed is under your curtailment orders. And so thank you for them. In looking over the draft resolution, I would like to make two suggestions. First, the change sheet continues to impose significant restrictions on the California Department of Fish and Game in terms of being able to investigate any flow regimes other than the very minimal flows that you have rolled over from the past few years, or flows even lower than those already inadequate minimums. I can understand that there should be reasonable reluctance in simply handing to Fish and Game a blank check to ask for any flow they feel like investigating. But to effectively limit them to only investigating sub-minimum flows doesn't seem desirable. And the likelihood that diverters already struggling under diversion constraints offering to be further constrained simply isn't a realistic expectation. In looking at the past curtailment years, it appears that while you have consistently specified a minimum flow, in fact, your minimum is being treated more as a target flow, with fluctuations frequently falling below it. That's not the definition of minimum. Here's my suggestion. Might it be possible to allocate to the Department of Fish and Game the accumulated volumes of water that was inappropriately diverted and so resulted in flows below your specified minimum to be used as a block of water or blocks of water to investigate the effects of flows higher than those minimums without the necessity of seeking permission from diverters? That change would do two things. It would remove any incentive to slide under what are supposed to be the minimum flow targets, and it would potentially add to our knowledge of what somewhat higher flows might yield. My second suggestion focuses on the details of the LCS process. We have all garnered extensive life experience with the range of human nature. In the case of LCSs, we should expect to find that there are many good and honest people who put an offer on the table and then live by it. Others who wiggle and squirm, looking for ways to game the system, and still others who are quite comfortable promising one thing and doing another. Keeping people good and honest requires that they don't suffer more than the gamers or those that are less than honest. Citizen monitoring is a potentially important piece of keeping the LCS system honest, but citizen monitoring with the LCSs is severely constrained by the redaction of location information for each LCS. Having participants knowing that the whole world might be watching would seemingly go a long ways towards minimizing the necessity of the use of water board staff time for oversight, investigation, and follow-up. I would like to suggest that the LCS proposals be posted in full, unredacted, as soon as received, in order to have full transparency in the process. And thank you for your ongoing attention to all these topics. I really appreciate your efforts and look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Mr. Webb. Appreciate those recommendations and participation here in today's discussion. Next, I'd like to call up Cody Phillips, be followed by Jeff Eisenberg, then Vivian Hellawell. Morning. Oh, it's a cold mic. There's a button on top of the mic, I think, right there. Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Good to see you.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel, members of the board. My name is Cody Phillips. I'm a staff attorney with California Coastkeeper Alliance, speaking in strong support of the readoption of these emergency regulations. Just laying the foundation here, this board has recognized in numerous contexts that your intervention is absolutely necessary to protect these commercially and culturally vital salmonids. And the readoption of these emergency regulations helps to fulfill your public trust obligations for at least one more year, at least while we consider something more long-term. For this process, I have two main comments for you today. First has to do with the informative digest. Right off the bat, staff, thank you. It was very, really well done. I think it covers the reasoning behind the board's actions very well, the science very well. My only caveat is the fiscal impact statement, which you've already kind of discussed a bit today, which focused exclusively on the costs of the emergency regulation, where the government code clearly allows you to look at savings as well. It's all too common in environmental circumstances to look at what it's going to cost industry, in this case, agriculture, to comply. But that is, a sad truth about environmental work is that it's almost always cheaper to overuse the environment, to harm it, rather than to protect it. And so to look at things like tax revenue losses for agriculture without even mentioning the tax revenue losses from the second year in a row of the closure of the salmon fishing industry, we think skews the economic impact and the consideration, the decision you have to make today. We understand this is an emergency regulation and a more thorough analysis is coming, but because a more thorough analysis is coming, we think it's important to flag that in this context to make sure that it is done well, over the next year. Second, I've a concern with the addition of the trading information for water component of the regulations. I appreciate that the board is developing a long-term approach here of trying to take information and use it for the long-term approach that is coming. And while I understand that better and more data is going to be immensely helpful, the board has other tools at its disposal. And the way that it's written now, it really strongly incentivizes right holders to withhold their water and use that in exchange. I think it was put in there with the idea of collaboration in mind, but I think it may have the alternate effects just the way it is currently written here. We do appreciate that CDFW is going to be the ultimate decider there, but this context is emergency regulations for bare minimum survival flows, and to allow us to go below those bare minimum flows for information in the long term may be helpful, but for the immediate needs that these regulations are meant to fill, we think it misses the point. So with those two comments in mind, CCKA does strongly support the readoption of these emergency regulations, and as well as the board's continued effort toward long-term flow recovery goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate those comments, Mr. Phillips. Good to see you here in person, and look forward to what I know will be further discussion, especially around the economic evaluation of the board's actions here. Next, I'd like to call up Jeff Eisenberg, we followed by Vivian Hellawell, then Conrad Fisher, and then Sherry Anderson. And Mr. Eisenberg, a note, I believe you asked for 10 minutes and that's granted.
Thank you, Chairman Esquivel and members of the board. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on behalf of Siskiyou County Farm Bureau. I believe that I'll be well short of 10 minutes, and I want to say there's no shame in cutting your remarks shorter than what's allotted. So first, I want to thank the board and the staff for the changes made to the section dealing with the study, which will have the effect of supporting a conversation CDFW and Farm Bureau have held for a number of months about sponsoring a study to determine the effect of various flow regimes on temperature and water quality for salmon in the Shasta Canyon. During the conversations, it's been said to me by stakeholders and state officials that they don't want to be given water up. And, who can blame them? We don't. Turns out, though, the farmers are people too, and they don't want to be giving up their water. I am gratified the board has taken a position that is supportive of the study. Only by relying on facts and science and not just on people's visceral reaction to situations can there be greater social acceptance of board regulation of the Scott and Shasta rivers. We will all have to live with whatever results that the study shows about the effects of variable flows on temperature in the canyon. But I want to elaborate just a little bit more and say, we've had detailed conversations with CDFW about this issue, and a genuine question of fact and science remains open here. And I'm optimistic from these conversations that we will be able to work well with CDFW. I commend their staff as warmly and deeply as I can. And we're having a responsible conversation about identifying the parameters and project design and all these matters. So I'm optimistic, and from my point of view, the support for this effort will strengthen regulation of the rivers in a responsible manner And so I'm very gratified that we're moving in a positive direction here. So thank you for that. More generally, we are consistently told the board wants to find solutions that work for all the stakeholders. And as difficult as they may be, and all the stakeholders understand at some level that the durable long-term solution will not work without the participation of the farmers and ranchers. Unfortunately, the Farm Bureau and its members are increasingly discouraged by the board's decisions that rely more on politics or bureaucratic convenience than facts or science. And in particular, the board's continued reliance on emergency regulations in the absence of dry conditions defies credibility and may exceed their legal authority. I understand, I think it's true, you don't know what the water year is going to look like in the summer. On the other hand, you never know what the weather is going to be like tomorrow. And, you know, the only thing you can do is make decisions based on what's the information before you at this time. And in fact, as has been pointed out by a number of speakers, there's a lot of water in the valleys right now. We understand the board has many thorny responsibilities, and I dare say even responsibilities which exceed the complexity of the Scott and Shasta situation. But that does not absolve the board of its responsibility for acting within the framework of the law. That's the highest trust that the government, the public officials have for serving the public. We view the issuance of the 2025 emergency regulation as an abuse of the board's authority under the Emergency Powers Act and an end around CEQA, which would otherwise apply to the matters above us. I understand there's a lack of resources to proceed as expeditiously as many people would like to have happen. But absent those resources to proceed in a timely manner, within the existing authorities, the board needs to be more creative and think harder about devising solutions other than reliance on emergency regulations. We extend our hand to the board to work together in identifying alternative solutions. We have a well-established record right now of trying hard to reach out to all stakeholders to move things forward. But my concern really is for the effectiveness of board action, and some of the ways these things are working is really harmful to support from the ag community. So we look forward to working together to support a sustainable salmon population and, of course, sustainable agriculture in the Scott and Shasta rivers. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Mr. Eisenberg. It's good to see you. And yes, no shame in coming in below time. And importantly, though, points taken and heard. It's incredibly important to me personally, and I know for board members here at the dais, that we keep the trust of the public and, of course, act accordingly within our legal frameworks. So your concerns are noted. I appreciate your comments, and ultimately look forward to continuing to work together here on this effort. So thank you, Mr. Eisenberg.
And thank you.
Next, I'd like to call up Vivian Hellwell, be followed by Conrad Fisher, then Sherry Anderson, and Amber Jameson.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and board members. My name is Vivian Hellwell, and first of all, I want to state my appreciation to the staff for all the hard work they've done and for this public conversation where everyone gets to weigh in. It's really helpful in making government work better for the public. My family's been fishing for 50 years. That's supported our family well, and we provide reliable domestic food supply to the market when we have salmon. We fished all up and down the California coast. We bring heart-healthy, local, high-quality protein to market. And we need these fish stock watering flows in order to provide that food crop. So it's another food crop that's grown with water from these rivers. The recovery strategy for California coho salmon has two objectives. one of which is to delist these fish by having viable, healthy populations. And the second objective, supported by Fish and Wildlife when they developed that recovery strategy, is a harvestable surplus for fishery-dependent communities, such as ocean commercial sport, in-river sport, and tribal fisheries. So farmers have their tractors, and we have boats for harvesting food. And when we have no fishing, we still have our fixed costs. I want to thank Board Member McGuire for talking about the costs and losses to these other communities that are also trying to make a living and provide food. And that these costs to us are not included in the fiscal analysis, but they're huge. We have a lot of people who are tied up right now and can't fish for salmon. We're hopeful that the improvements in these major important watersheds, the Scott and Shasta, will help, as well as the access to the Upper Klamath. So we understand what it's like to have losses from not being able to apply your trade. The curtailment of fishing for these healthier stocks like Chinook and are a way that we have of providing stewardship, because they protect the weaker stocks like the coho that we're trying to bring back from the verge of extinction. Now, if you put these emergency flows in place for this year, which I support, that even if it turns out that it was a good water year and there's lots of water in the river, then it won't hurt anybody to have these minimum flow requirements, because there'll be more water than that. If there's not enough water later in the year, then we need to have those minimum flows in place and have them supported with, the monitoring and the other things that we've asked for in our comments. So we really appreciate the efforts of farmers and ranchers on the Scott and Shasta rivers who are trying to help the fish and participate in voluntary efforts. As we're all in this together. If we lose these fish, they're gone for good. Right now, we're not even close to a recovery of the ESA listed stocks. But we see benefit in the past 3 years from these curtailments that have been in effect. And even though they are costly in the short term, the environment and the ecosystem supports all of us in the long term, is economically beneficial to everyone. So our short-term costs are, we're not fishing, farmers can't grow as much. So please put these limits into effect in case we need them this summer. And that's about it on my comments today. We need to recover these iconic fish that so many communities rely on and still have farming and ranching in the valley. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Really appreciate your time, Ms. Hallowell, and continued engagement here in our discussion and advocacy. Thank you. Much appreciated. Next, I'll call up Conrad Fisher, be followed by Sherry Anderson, then Amber Jameson, and Nathaniel Kane.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Good morning.
Hi, thank you. I'm Conrad Fisher with Water Climate Trust. My home is on the Klamath River downstream from the Scott and Shasta. So I'm very much affected by what happens here personally. I'm here to say, please adopt the emergency regulations with a few caveats that I'll explain. It is unfortunate that emergency drought regulations are the tool we have, but that is what we have. And to some of the previous comments from water board members and Ms. Sweeney, there is a drought every year for the fish, regardless of how much water nature gives us. There are enough water rights in both the Scott and the Shasta without in-stream flow requirements that the rivers would be completely dry. The Scott, by virtue of having one water right at the mouth, is there's other reasons the Shasta doesn't go completely dry, but there are enough unexercised water rights to dewater both rivers in any year. So please adopt these regulations for now, but let's look toward a longer term solution. Again, what nature is giving us is relevant, but it is not determinative here. A couple of changes I would request, starting with the change sheet. I would really ask you to consider eliminating the very last sentence of the change sheet, the one that was included on the agenda, which reads, if such alternative flows are higher than described, the proposal requires agreement from affected water right holders. It's a little bit rich to hear the Farm Bureau say they want additional information, but here we have a prohibition against CDFW experimenting with higher flows to see what the effects are. The best available science says these flows are not intended to achieve long-term recovery. They are something less. So to prohibit experimentation without unanimous consent of water right holders is, I'm asking you to eliminate that. And who are the water right holders? Am I an in-stream water right holder? What about the downstream in-stream water right holders, commercial fishing, everybody else? I'm pretty sure this change sheet only means out of stream water users in the Scott and Shasta Valley. So please consider eliminating that. The draft resolution and regulation, I guess I would just draw your attention to one portion of that. It's page 22 of the PDF, page 7 of the regulation about tributary-wide local cooperative solutions. You've heard a lot about benefits and pitfalls of local cooperative solutions. There are two issues with this tributary-wide local cooperative solution. One is that the deputy director may approve them regardless of whether we achieve the flows. Again, these flows should be viewed as a bare minimum baseline below which we do not want to go. So this section I of the local cooperative solutions allows just that. And then the section just below that also, as others have said, allows information to be a substitute for actual water. I've heard from many salmon that information and meetings and paper and money are not substitutes for water. So right now I ask you to revise the local cooperative solutions. They should be viewed, I'm suggesting, as a way to lessen the burden on the ag community, not a substitute for in-stream flows. And then finally, looking to the future, the October 16th resolution, I and others were very disappointed, did not embrace this language suggested by many fisheries advocates that the goal of the scientific basis report be recovery. It's something less. So at some point, I'd love to know why that happened, but I'm asking, can we, moving forward, implement the emergency regs and anything else such that we at least don't close the door to determining what fish need to not go extinct and recover and ideally have harvestable surplus. We keep hearing these goals, but these are not the goals in the October 16th resolution. So again, can we reconsider doing the science necessary to actually achieve those goals? One of the biggest reasons we haven't gotten recovery flows is because a lot of the science already done is not toward that goal. And then finally, the economic analysis. You've heard a lot about the fiscal impacts reports. Every aspect of this really needs to go into the cost of inaction, the cost to in-stream beneficial uses and users of water, including the commercial fishery, the tribal fishery, and the sport fishery. There are economic ways to place values on those things. For the commercial fishery or tourism, for example, there are ways to actually place dollar amounts for in-stream tribal beneficial uses. We've heard it's harder to place a value on those things. What is the cost of knowing your grandkids or of our grandkids losing salmon in the freezer? There are ways to do that, contingent valuation, things like that, but right now it's left out. So all of that is left out. And closing point, there are substitutes for the ag community. I'm not sure if the Farm Bureau gentleman who spoke before was part of this history, but in the very beginning of the idea of a water trust, of voluntary environmental water transactions, there was a debate between what the Scott River Water Trust ended up doing, which was voluntary temporary transactions versus using all of the public money available to do transactions that resulted in permanent demand reduction. I proposed to the Farm Bureau to support voluntary permanent demand reduction. They initially supported it, but pushback from a supervisor caused them to reverse course, and they have stayed on that course ever since. My point is that the ag community has alternatives, and those who depend on in-stream beneficial uses of water do not have alternatives once salmon are gone. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for yours as well. Appreciate those comments, Mr. Fisher. Good to see you and appreciate the continued engagement in this effort. Next, I'd like to call up Sherry Anderson, to be followed by Amber Jameson, then Nathaniel Kane and Alex Beering.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sherry Anderson, and I'm a fish biologist with NOAA Fisheries, and I work in the Klamath Basin. And I'm just here today to provide support from our agency to extend the minimum in-stream flow requirements. A particular concern for us is the ESA listed Swamp coho salmon that are in the Scott and Shasta rivers. And coho salmon are unique in the fact that they have a life history requirement to stay an entire year in fresh water, which means that they're more sensitive to the environmental conditions there. And our agency has identified the Scott River as a key location, a priority for recovery. And this is a West Coast region-wide priority for the next 5 years that we work to recover fish in the Scott River. And that's was identified because we understand that the Scott River is particularly important for our overall recovery strategy of fish in the Sonk ESU. So with the extension of the minimum in-stream flow requirements, we expect that we will see we'll increase our time of connectivity in the main stem. And that's really important because these fish have seasonal migration strategies where they move into tributaries to rear during the summer, and adults need to access those tributaries to find their high quality spawning grounds. So it's important that we have these biological minimums in place so those fish can get to those key habitats and increase their survival. And then I just want to speak to a few of the other comments about the indications of the good water year. We also are really encouraged by those early indications of the good water year, but of course we don't know exactly how this will play out by the summer period. So we encourage adopting this minimum in-stream flow just in the chance that that the water year doesn't play out as we hope. If it does, if we have got a great water year, it'll be a win-win for everybody, with irrigation being able to proceed without curtailments and fish having their biological minimum flows. But if it doesn't work out that way, it's important that we have this backstop of a bare minimum biological flow that will protect these fish that are listed on the Endangered Species Act. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Ms. Anderson. Appreciate your comments and participation today and the continued coordination here with the federal agencies. Your expertise and voice here is appreciated, so thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Amber Jameson, be followed by Nathaniel Kane, and then Alex Beering.
Hi there. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Amber Jameson, and I work with the Environmental Protection Information Center. I wanted to thank you for bringing us here today and providing this opportunity to comment. I strongly support readoption of the Scott and Shasta River emergency regulations, which have provided important protections for salmonids. I also support the board's goal of adopting long-term regulations. I appreciate the board's being proactive to address these issues now rather than in the middle of a crisis so that people can prepare and coordinate for the best possible outcome. My primary concern is that the Scott and Shasta water rights are over allocated, and regardless of the water year type, even with emergency regulations, we're seeing flow issues every year. Since the emergency flows go unmet for weeks at a time, resulting in less than baseline flows, I would consider those essentially extinction flows that further the decline of fisheries. I implore the board to prepare environmental and economic studies that not only include baseline flows, but also recovery flows. And I urge the water board to include an economic analysis of the true costs of not having a harvestable surplus of salmon. In addition to the suicide epidemic that swept the region when fisheries were closed, the effects of an altered diet on the health of Kuduk people was published by Kari Norgard, and that identifies the elimination of salmon and other traditional foods leading to extreme adverse health, social, economic, and spiritual impacts on Kuduk people. NORGARD's report has a lot of good facts and data to support these conclusions, and it states that, quote, the loss of traditional food sources is now recognized as being directly responsible for a host of diet and related illnesses among Native Americans, including diabetes, obesity, heart disease, tuberculosis, hypertension, kidney troubles, and strokes. It goes on to state that the estimated diabetes rate for the Kuduk tribe is 21%, nearly 4 times the US average. The estimated rate of heart disease for the Kuduk tribe is 39.6%. That's 3 times the US average. So I implore the board to take into account all of the costs of not having salmon if you're not going to be considering recovery flows. In addition to addressing commercial and recreational salmon fishing in the economic analysis, it's critical that the board take into account the impacts and costs associated with the loss of a traditional based diet, including salmon. Last year, the local cooperative solutions did not appear to meet the water board requirements for data metering equipment and did not have sufficient metering plans or data available, despite the water board having large quantities of money set aside to give away to people to install meters. So it just shows that like these folks who, you know, are not installing the meters, they're not complying with the plans. I feel like, you know, the transparency is like really essential to build trust. And so I request that the board have more transparency for the public to review and monitor water diversion and extraction data, especially since the Water Board Enforcement Department is driven by public participation. So if people living in the watershed area are not even allowed to see what diversions are permitted, how can violations be reported? At a minimum, I believe that local watershed groups and stakeholders who've been involved in the process should have access to this data. If you guys are afraid of sharing it among the public in general, I think that transparency will help build the trust and compliance among the stakeholders because, you know, there's transparency and people will be held accountable. Also, data transparency should not be traded for more water. I would, you know, implore the board to revisit and amend sections of 875 or section 875 to ensure that information is not traded as a benefit equal to in-stream flow. The regulations need to include provisions to address groundwater extraction also, since it's connected to surface waters, and the extractions resulting in impacts to in-stream flows. Groundwater metering provisions need to be provided to the water board to ensure minimum flows are met. Also, key tributaries are really important here, and they need to have a specified number, minimum flow numbers, because, for example, when minimum in-stream flow requirements were being met, Shackleford was sometimes running dry and causing strandings of endangered coho salmon. And then there's the diversion ditch right next door to the Bear River that's full of water and delivering irrigation water at a time when it, you know, it should have water in it for salmon. In order to ensure these tributaries remain functional, it's necessary that gauges be placed in key tributaries to monitor fishery benefits for all life stages of salmonids. And so in closing, I would just like to request that the staff conduct biological and economic studies that evaluate baseline flows as well as recovery flows, and ensure that economic studies assess the true costs associated with the loss of salmon as a staple diet for Indigenous people along the Klamath River. If you're including impacts to the local ag community, you also have to include impacts to Indigenous people, which is part of the racial equity policies adopted by this board. That said, I would like to thank the board and staff for all the work you've done this far to prioritize in-stream flows on the Scott and Shasta rivers. And I really do look forward to continuing our work together to develop adequate flows and see this recovery in the Scott and Shasta. It's a really incredible time right now with Klamath Dam removal, and, you know, these salmon are coming back, and these tributaries are really important to seeing, you know, the repopulation of the upper basin. We're dependent on these tributaries. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and effort on this, and I'll let you move on.
Thank you as well. Appreciate your time and hear comments and consideration, Ms. Jameson. I look forward to what I know will be further discussion. So thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Nathaniel Kane, be followed by Alex Beering, then Glenn Spain and Andrew Marks.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and members of the board. It's good to see you all. My name is Nathaniel Kane. I'm the Executive Director of Environmental Law Foundation. I'm here today on behalf of the Karuk Tribe, Environmental Law Foundation, Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations, and the Institute for Fisheries Resources. The Karuk tribe and these groups support the adoption of these emergency regulations. We also support the broader effort to secure flows that will lead to recovery and sustainability of these fisheries in the Scott and Shasta rivers in perpetuity. We support this board's recognition that these rivers need protection, that without legal protection for minimum flows, and the board's energetic monitoring and enforcement, every year is a drought year in the Scott and the Shasta. As we showed in our petition for a permanent regulation that we filed last year, prior to these regulations, minimum flows were not met in all except the very wettest years in recent decades. Indeed, the last year where the Scott reached the CDFW interim flow recommendation for September flows, when Coho began to run, was 1998. The last year where it met the minimum drought flows was 2017. And for perspective, as compared to this year, 2 weeks ago, the Scott River saw a peak flow of 8,000 CFS, which was the highest since 2017. But in 2017, that figure was 15,000 CFS. So we all want the faucet to turn on again and to see a really wet winter and a really wet spring. But without these emergency regulations, it is very likely that these rivers will go dry this summer and not provide adequate habitat for listed and culturally and economically vital species. And so we appreciate the board's commitment, consistent with the public trust doctrine, the waste and unreasonable use doctrine, its regulatory authority, and the governor's salmon strategy to protecting coho salmon, fall run Chinook, steelhead, and Pacific lamprey in these rivers. The value of these healthy populations of these species cannot be overstated. They are the lifeblood of tribal communities along the Klamath and its tributaries, and they've been the economic backbone of communities up and down the California coast, and we hope that they soon will be again. Now, to speak a little bit about the fiscal analysis that's been the subject of discussion this morning, it's often framed in terms of the cost of the regulation, and we understand that there's particular language in the Emergency Regulation Authority that leads to that interpretation. But that's not the full picture. A healthy, abundant fishery with a harvestable surplus in the Klamath Basin is a massive economic benefit to the region and to the state as a whole. And that's not to mention the health, monetary, and dietary benefits, along with the incalculable cultural value to tribal communities of restoring salmon populations to what they were within living memory. These emergency regulations will take a step towards that possible future. And I just want to mention the baseline for these analyses. The costs in these analyses seem to be based off a baseline level of water use that likely did not comply with the public trust doctrine, and which this board has found potentially unreasonable. So we're aware of these rules for calculating these analyses, but the baseline issue is something that we're going to be returning to, and we hope to be meeting with staff and providing additional data on these issues as we prepare the economic report for later this year. All of that said, we have a few additional concerns about this iteration of the emergency regulation. As we pointed out in our comments, we believe that the LCS provisions and the graduated succession LCS in particular is not necessarily calculated to achieve the minimum flows required. This is demonstrated by the fact that despite somewhat better hydrology this past year, the Scott River did dip below the minimum flows for a period in August. I want to echo the concern about particular tributaries, especially Shackelford. There have been issues with disconnection even when the Fort Jones gauge is meeting the minimum flow. We want to work on a regulatory approach to solving this issue. And that could be as simple as a visual confirmation that there's enough flow in that creek to get fish in during migration windows. That would be a start. Obviously, we want it to be more robust over time. We're concerned about transparency. We're concerned about the availability of location data through this program. Some of this data is available elsewhere, but it just creates an extra hassle to go track it down and piece it together, especially on the short comment deadlines for LCSs. We want to ensure metering data goes to the board so that the board can analyze it and so that there aren't extra hassles dealing with the PRA for the public to get access to that data. And we're concerned about this information benefit issue. The regulations already set minimum survival flows. Information is important, of course, but it cannot offset the minimum amount of water that fish need to live. There's no extra water that can be traded for information. And the board already has access to all the information it should need through its information order authority that's already in these regulations. And that information can be provided to CDFW. So we don't see the need for adding this language to the e-regs this year. Last, we hope that this emergency regulation is one of the last times we need to do this. A permanent regulation is absolutely vital in these rivers. We greatly appreciate the board's direction to move forward with the scientific basis report and the economic analysis that will be the underpinning of such a permanent approach. We, the groups I'm speaking on behalf, are gathering data. We hope to meet with staff soon to provide additional data and to help staff think through what those reports might look like. Hope to do that soon. In closing, I also want to particularly thank staff for working hard on this regulatory package over the last several months. I know it's a ton of work to put it together. The digest is incredibly thorough, and I know that a lot of the work happened over the holidays. Thank you. We support adopting the regulation.
Thank you as well, Mr. Kane. Appreciate those comments and continued engagement here, and agree with you that we do need to focus on the long term here as well, even as we are here readopting on an emergency basis. So just thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Alex Beering, be followed by Glenn Spain, Andrew Marks, Ryan Walker, and I believe our last commenter at that moment will be Craig Tucker. Ms. Beering, good to see you.
Good to see you guys. Good morning. Happy New Year. So I represent California Farm Bureau, California's oldest and largest statewide organization representing farmers and ranchers. And of course, we have Siskiyou County Farm Bureau representatives also who have spoken today and will speak in a little bit, and they are fantastic. So I would definitely support what they say, but I just wanted to make a few of our own comments from California Farm Bureau. So we understand that because the governor's drought emergency hasn't been lifted, that this is the power that you guys have to do this sort of thing, and that an emergency regulation is really the tool that's available to you right now for preserving flows. And so we get why this is happening. But again, and I think this is something that many other speakers have commented on and touched on, this is like, now we're heading into the fourth consecutive year of doing this emergency regulation. And 2 of those years at least are not really severe drought years. And so I think, as you heard from Jeff Eisenberg earlier, it's starting to kind of rub people in a way that I think they didn't necessarily expect going into this, 3 years ago. Continually issuing and approving emergency regulations each year has a practical impact of imposing a semi-permanent regulation in place, even if there are tweaks here and there on a yearly basis. But it comes without the transparency and accountability that you would have from a permanent rulemaking, right? Including like a CEQA process and public process requirements. And so I think, as a result, there's really not been a true accounting and disclosure of the full impacts, and not just economic impacts to the region, but we're talking about environmental impacts and other sorts of impacts and social impacts that come from having something that is continuous, that is not really implemented on a one-off basis, but is just rolled over year to year to year. And so I think that's true even with the fiscal impact that was presented today and that was included in the really thorough staff analysis, which Board Member McGuire referenced, and I think others have as well. So, and I've heard other people say this too, that whether you're coming at it from the fisheries perspective or from the ag perspective, people are wanting a little bit more of a full accounting of what the continual impact of this is, both I think positive and negative. And I think those are things that are actually helpful and useful long-term as the collaborative group starts working towards a longer-term management plan. Those are important inputs for them as they consider how to do that. I don't think it's necessarily an argument for proceeding with a permanent rulemaking, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge that from that angle, the emergency regulation, which is an imperfect tool, becomes more imperfect every year that it happens. And so I just wanted to make sure that people are acknowledging that, and it sounds like some of those are. And so it just makes it more urgent to find an enforceable management plan that is acceptable to tribes, landowners, and the board in the near term. And I know those discussions are ongoing, but these sorts of things take a long time. Our Farm Bureau's January 2nd, 2025 comment letter raises multiple concerns related to that and also the precedential nature of continued reliance on the drought-related emergency orders when hydrologic conditions may not warrant them in Siskiyou County, which you guys summarized very well on the screen earlier in the PowerPoint presentation. So appreciate that you have digested all that information in that long and thorough comment letter. Also pleased to see that some of the recommendations are being considered from the Siskiyou County Farm Bureau's November 19th comment letter. Always appreciate how much consideration you give to the input from locals on the ground, whether that is the farmers and ranchers or the tribes and others up there. I know you've spent an inordinate amount of time, hundreds and hundreds of hours between staff and board members doing that. And I just want to recognize again that that is not unnoticed and it is very much appreciated. So finally, we appreciate that dialogue and hope it continues as this process moves forward, and to the extent that I or anyone else at Farm Bureau can be helpful at the state level, we're here to help and appreciate all the work that's gone on. Thank you.
Appreciate your work as well. Good to see you, Ms. Beering. Thank you for the comments, points taken, certainly, and look forward to what I know will be further discussion. Next, I'd like to call up Glenn Spain, be followed by Andrew Marks, Ryan Walker, and our last commenter will be Craig Tucker.
Glenn here. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you. And I'll note, I believe you asked for 10 minutes as well, and that's granted. So thank you.
I'll note that a prior speaker said there's no shame in being succinct, so I'll do my best. I want to underscore the comments that were made on our behalf by Nat Kane and Vivian Hellwell previously, and just add a few bits. Again, the problematical language in section 875 having to do with trading information for water. We can't we can't understand the rationale behind that, frankly. These are basic minimum flows. To have less than that with more information, all that means is that we have a very well documented extinction event. Fish swim in water, they do not swim in information. We really need to keep that in mind. So when we're talking bare minimum flows, we're talking bare minimum flows. We're not talking about something that can be traded down. In terms of the fiscal impacts, I want to point that out. You say fiscal impacts. Well, fiscal impacts requires the costs and benefits, both positive and negatives. It doesn't say that you analyze only the costs to one sector of that equation. And that's what we've seen to date, is the cost to agriculture of change. There is a huge cost of doing nothing. There's a huge cost of doing nothing. And I footnoted, by the way, a report, our footnote 2 in our comments for this hearing, to a report that was produced by Institute for Fisheries Resources in 1998. And in $1999, the value of the salmon runs from the Klamath was over $137.4 million a year in personal income impacts. The largest portion of that was from the Scott and Shasta. That supported originally 6,870 jobs all up and down the coast and nationally, regionally. Those jobs are gone. Those runs are gone. They were also restricted in terms of harvest of all other runs in Northern California and Southern Oregon because of the weak stocks in the Klamath. We're bound by what's called weak stock management. The weakest stock is the determining factor. The stocks in the Scott and Shasta are the determining factor for our whole Northern California fisheries. The importance of returning those runs to healthy, abundant levels is enormous. And the costs of that are minimal compared to the economic benefits. We're talking about benefits of millions of dollars. We're talking about restoring the fundamental basis of thousands of jobs. So that is what the fiscal impacts needs to look. It needs to look at the cost of the baseline, the cost of doing nothing, which is enormous, and the benefits of change, which are also enormous in this case. I want to point out that money spent working to recover salmon runs in the Klamath and the Scott and Shasta in particular, is an investment. It's not a flat cost. It's an investment in a return of harvestable fish and a return of a major important ecosystem that benefits society indefinitely, in perpetuity. So that has to be also factored into your fiscal analysis. And one last bit, just a little bit of logic here. If it's a drought year, the drought declaration kicks in. If it is not a drought year, if it is a wet year, or even above normal year, there'll be plenty of water, so no one in the ag sector will be curtailed. The fear of curtailment indefinitely in a wet year is ridiculous. From a logical viewpoint, that can't happen. So I understand the angst about it, but from a logical viewpoint, if we must go under the current declaration of drought emergency, it's a procedural tool. If it's a wet year, there won't be any curtailments. So that's all I have to add. And again, we strongly support moving forward on this one. Just a reminder, the Klamath fisheries, the Klamath salmon runs were once the third largest runs in the continental U.S. They're now down to a small fraction, very small fraction, and a large portion of it is ESA listed as a result. We can do better than that. The benefits to society, the benefits to our economy of doing better than that are enormous, and that is what the fiscal impact needs to address. And that report, by the way, is footnoted in our footnote 2. It's titled, "The Cost of Doing Nothing, the Economic Burden of Salmon Declines in the Klamath Basin." And I commend that to your staff. Thank you very much for all your hard work. This is not easy, but the benefits to society and the benefits to the economy of getting this right are enormous and well worth the effort for all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Spain. Good to see you. Appreciate those comments and continued engagement here in this discussion. Many thanks. Next, I'd like to call up Andrew Marks, be followed by Ryan Walker, and then Craig Tucker.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and members of the board. My name is Andrew Marks. I'm the Shasta River steward for the Native Fish Society. And I'm here to support the continuation of the curtailments on the Shasta River. I guess the elephant in the room is the fact that there have been a couple of decent water years, which would be the only reason to argue against curtailments. But the bottom line is that curtailments were required after the start of irrigation season this year, because every year on the Shasta River is essentially a drought, because long before any of the fish were thought, the river's water resources were over allocated without, like I said, any regard to the fish. What we have is, primarily a focus on ESA listed coho, but the other important fish are river type Chinook that over summer in the river, and also the steelhead. They're all vital species of salmonids for the Klamath River. The last time we exceeded dispensation levels for coho in the Shasta River was 10 years ago, in the 2012-13 time period. Since then, the levels have been below 50 fish a year, which is essentially heading toward extinction. We had 41 return this year. The river and the fish deserve a fair share of the water that's available. There's, the farming community is vital to Siskiyou County, and I think the curtailments have shown that the farming community can survive, has been able to coexist with the curtailments in place. It's not an either or situation. Until there's a permanent minimum flow in place on the Shasta River, curtailments are the only way that the fish that depend on the river and the water in the Shasta and the Klamath River as a whole, because the Shasta River is a huge proportion of the Klamath fish runs, the curtailments are essential to that until there's a permanent flow rule in place. I thank you for your time, and I encourage the board to essentially keep the curtailments in place for another year until we hopefully have a permanent solution to deal with the over allocation of the Shasta's valuable public water resource. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time as well, Mr. Marks. Appreciate the comments here and the engagement. Look forward to the further discussion with you all. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Ryan Walker, be followed by Craig Tucker.
Hello, I'm Ryan Walker, President of Siskiyou County Farm Bureau. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'd like to respond to a few comments real quickly first. There's been a common statement that landowners and water users should not be concerned about curtailments in a wet year because there'll be water and so the curtailments won't happen or be minor. That doesn't correctly understand the situation. The way the emergency regs work, we can't take the catastrophic risk of curtailment, so we're extorted into entering into LCSs, which require us to give up water early in the season. And so regardless of the water year, we will enter LCSs, we will give up 30% of our water early on or give up the corners on our pivots or whichever we choose, but that's a real cost no matter whether curtailments come into play or not. And so it's factually untrue that the emergency regs don't cost us if there's not actually a curtailment. Second, I'll note, and I appreciate sort of the honesty of some of the commenters, that the water year is no longer relevant. The predicate in theory is that there is an emergency every year in the Scott and Shasta, and as a result, I'm not entirely sure why we're even talking about permanent interim regs. If that's the case, if the board can go every year on this redefinition of what a drought emergency is. The reality is we're not in a drought emergency, and the excuses for what's going on today really just boil down to the end justify the means, and it's an admirable end. I appreciate that, but the approach is I think on its face. We would argue contrary to California law. And I think that Farm Bureau stands ready and landowners stand ready to have a serious negotiation about how to come to a compromise solution. We've offered solutions in the Shasta, which give almost everything, and even in some cases a little more than what the regs give. And, we've gotten nowhere with that. And so it's frustrating that this is what we're being told. I will end my comments simply noting a number of points for the purposes of exhausting our remedies at this stage of the regulation. As I noted, the emergency regs fail to meet the predicate requirement of having a true emergency. 3 wet years more than eliminated the tail of any drought that existed. Second, I'd note that the proposed emergency regulations violate California's Environmental Quality Act, both in spirit and in letter, by providing now a 4 and probably a 5 or 6 year regulation without CEQA protections for that have been passed by the California legislature. And lastly, I'll say that the board action of passing the emergency regs today will deny equal protection to the landowners in the Scott and Shasta. And with that, I'll close my comments and again, just be absolutely clear. Our position is that these regs should not be passed today, and the board and the stakeholders should return to the table with landowners to find a compromise and, more importantly, a legal solution to the salmon issue in the two valleys. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for yours as well, Mr. Walker. It's good to hear from you, and look forward and I appreciate the discussions we've been able to have. And your dissent here certainly is noted, your points are noted, but look forward to being able to continue to engage with one another on this important matter. And just thank you for the leadership and continued work around it. So thank you. Next, I'd like to call up Craig Tucker.
Thank you, members of the board, for giving me an opportunity to speak and bringing this to the table. First of all, just to say the Karuk tribe wholeheartedly endorses, supports, and agrees with the letter prepared by Environmental Law Foundation on behalf of PCFFA. We didn't make it on the letterhead only because of the conflicts associated with the holidays last month. It's important that we approve this today because if we wait until we get into the summer and discover we're back, if it doesn't rain anymore, we get to May and discover we're in a drought. By the time we reconvene, get rules on the table and approve them, summer's over, fish kills happen, and it's all for naught. So approving this today allows us to put regulations in place so that if it continues to rain, we have a wet year, we won't need curtailments. If Mother Nature doesn't provide, we will need them, and the regulations are in place. And I'll admit that this is an imperfect tool for the job, but some of that is simply the fault of agriculture. Back in as far as 2012, we tried to implement an incidental take permit program in Scott Valley, and local producers fought it tooth and nail, didn't want to be regulated. Local agriculture could come anytime, could come forward with things like habitat conservation plans to develop their version of how they could conserve water to meet the needs of fish. They simply haven't done it. They fought these things every step of the way. And I'll also point out that these regulations have not created economic hard times for ag. You can look back in Siskiyou County's economic reports, agricultural reports, and see that in years of drought, the price of hay goes up and the profit margins, or at least the revenue of irrigated agriculture in Siskiyou County remains pretty steady or goes up almost every year. So we're not creating some kind of economic problem for agriculture by implementing this, going back and looking at the economic metrics. We just pulled off a magnificent step here on the Klamath to reverse these trends of fish headed towards extinction with the removal of the main stem dams. We know now that as soon as those dams came out, over 6,000 fish swam past Iron Gate Canyon looking for places to spawn in reaches upstream of the dams. Now is not the time to short fish on water in the tributaries. The Shasta River is the biggest producer of wild Chinook salmon in the Klamath system. The Scott River is the biggest producer of wild coho salmon in the Klamath River, but these fish have to be wet. Experts predict that because of dam removal and the great flows we've been getting here in the month of December, we're going to see a significant reduction in the polychaete worms that's the host of this fish disease called Ceratophrygmus shasta this year. That means that these fish that come out of the Scott and the Shasta will probably have one of the best chances for survival getting out to ocean and coming back in 4 years than they've had in decades. Now is simply not the time to short these fish. And this administration and this governor has called this out specifically in the salmon restoration strategy, that these two streams in particular are vitally important for the recovery of Klamath River salmon. So I urge you guys to move forward and implement these regulations. And with that, I'll conclude my comments. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks for your time as well. Appreciate those comments, Mr. Tucker. It's good to see you, and just thanks for the continued contributions here. All right, I believe that brings us to the end of our commenters. Looking to the room, please do just jump up, raise your hand if you're looking to speak as well on the platform in case somehow we've missed you. But just first, always just really appreciate and thankful for the engagement here, for the comments, the continued work here within the watershed. Again, I know these issues are fraught, and ultimately there is quite a bit of tension around the work. But the goal always of this board and for ourselves here amongst us is to try to bring folks together, to have a fair space, to have open and honest discussion around how we best balance what is an imbalance ultimately in our watersheds, and a sense of urgency, certainly, that I feel that these years that we have here collectively together, the learning, the work, the effort that's gone in has yielded some continued light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, some progress and some consensus. But these years now are so critical, and concerned that we this isn't the time to lose momentum amongst it. I want to acknowledge the concern or the feeling that the board is somewhat stretching itself here when it comes to using these emergency authorities. Again, I think we've laid out our rationale why we feel we're still within our legal bounds, but just acknowledge that folks are feeling concerned that the yearly readoption here of the emergency curtailments somewhat circumvents or isn't as thorough ultimately as at the long-term process. So looking to see these two efforts merge truly and know that we have an opportunity to do that. I have a few questions. We did hear concern around some of the flexibility that's been built into this year's emergency curtailment. Just wondering if folks from the program have some comment when it comes to that. I know there was also some mention around the local cooperative solutions maybe not being as transparent as they could and tracked. And so just wanting to hear sort of feedback from some of those criticisms as to some of the flexibility that's being brought in, and the concern we heard that we're necessarily trading water for data amongst it. Just wanting to hear what sort of how it's folks are seeking to implement it in this coming year, and some ultimately safeguards or ways in which those concerns from folks are being addressed.
I'll try and touch on all of those. If I miss something, please flag it so I can circle back appropriately. With respect to the local cooperative solutions, equal or better determinations, and the clarifications providing for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to consider information and data, that is something we saw as part of the French Creek local cooperative solution, and we thought it was important to note that that can be a key piece of information. I think there is the concern from folks appropriately that, we don't want people to stop giving us information and then say they'll give it to us after the fact. This information is not the type of information that we would expect to get under a water board information order. We're looking at things that California Department of Fish and Wildlife thinks is beneficial for them to get over the longer run to inform what flows are appropriate, maybe in a tributary. That was definitely what we saw in the French Creek local cooperative solution. And also just being transparent about the flexibility and the benefit that can be associated with that. But we're not talking about things about water use. How much water are you using? Those are not the types of equal or better types of information that we would expect CDFW to be considering in making a determination that something's equal or better from a local cooperative solution standpoint. Specific about that.
Board Member Firestone.
Yeah, sorry, just specific on that since appreciate. I guess I'm just wondering, in this case, was it information specific to a tributary? And is there some way that distinguishes that's another distinguishing constraint? And I guess how do we know that, how are there constraints in our regs that ensures that this isn't abused or, leading to trends of withholding information that we could do by information order?
Right. So I think good points are being brought up. I want to say this is a one-year regulation. If people abuse this provision, it's probably not something we'd want to continue in a longer-term regulation or consider. So I think that's one facet of it. I think the type of information that we saw with the French Creek local cooperative solution was this benefit of being able to look at flows and fish in specific areas that wouldn't have been available to CDFW outside of that. And that doesn't mean they would approve that again this year because they've obtained that information. So they would be looking for something different and evaluating things differently this year than they would last year because it's equal or better and they don't necessarily need the same thing that they needed at that time. So it's dynamic. And I think that's the difficulty with these types of local cooperative solutions. We've had very few of them approved. So in terms of like, how do we know it's not going to be abused? It's a pretty high standard to meet with equal or better. And CDFW takes that seriously when evaluating and working with folks on potential local cooperative solutions. But again, we're talking about a 1-year time frame here, and if it is abused, I think it's a lesson learned that maybe we shouldn't have that type of flexibility.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh,
And-
transparency.
Yeah.
Sorry. There was a question about transparency with the groundwater local cooperative solutions. We do redact personal information related to, addresses, phone numbers, all of that type of thing when we post our local cooperative solutions. We also do post a smaller subset of the information online. So that's, the overall proposal. We haven't put up maps and things like that, just recognizing the sensitivity that folks do have with their personal property. That doesn't mean it's not available if folks choose to ask for that, but it's not something we are posting directly on the website at this time. So it's sort of a balancing of, the interests that are out there and trying to, finesse that, the interests of the ag community, the interests of other parties.
Yeah, I really appreciate that consideration and ultimately that balance between having enough information that again we're able to verify to do our work, but also keeping some faith and trust with local landowners as well, and them not wanting to see that information somehow abused or folks specifically gone after in a way that's inappropriate. So appreciate that balance and appreciate just the conversation and feedback as to the decision making around that. So thank you. My other question would just be around gauging. And I know that we really determined, at this moment as we readopt that we don't have enough information as to be a little more granular gauge perhaps at some of the tributaries, or at least work that into the official sort of curtailment work that we're doing. We're just wondering what our opportunities are nonetheless over the course of the next year to start to get that granularity, because it is something that we're hearing both from tribes, from advocates in the community on conservation, but also from the ag community, where there is a bit of a desire for us to approach things here with less of sort of a blunt tool of just a single point of compliance. But again, I understand, we're not at a point now and we don't have the gauging in place to be able to have that be part of the current readoption, but just wondering if you could speak to what the opportunities are here nonetheless in the next year. I know part of that is the fact that we do have funding to put in gauges. And, if we have local landowners that are willing to work with us to do so, really encourage folks to do that. That is a way that we can get out there and get more granular information, especially when it comes to what's happening on the tributaries as they connect with the Scott and the Shasta. But I'm just wondering if, they're absent, again, that's sort of incorporating that here into this formal adoption. What can we sort of work toward really in this next year to better get us in a place where we can do that perhaps?
Yeah, there's quite a few I would say nuances about gauging in these watersheds. So there's quite a bit of gauging that has occurred historically. We have the 2 gauges that we use as compliance points in the regulation. Those 2 gauges for compliance points are rated and overseen by the USGS, United States Geological Survey. That's pretty important because folks want to be able to trust the flows that we are implementing curtailments to, and they want to feel that those are accurately reflecting on the ground conditions. And even those gauges, at times we hear from folks, we don't think that's the right flow. There's this flow up at my property and the flow down at the gauge is not normally this flow. And, we work with USGS to get out there and rate the gauge, but they're good about that. So even with these very good gauges that are QA/QC'd and rated on a regular basis, there are questions and concerns. So we don't have appropriate gauges, and it takes a while to rate a gauge to be appropriately used for this type of regulatory process. So I would say we do have funding for gauges. We had several rounds of engagement with the community about where we should input these gauges that we're going to have for a couple years under a USGS contract. And we've selected some locations. We're working with the water master to make sure they're aware of those locations and to, make sure they're appropriately gauged and we get good data and we can share that with the community. I think the other thing the board staff have been doing in the watershed since the emergency regulations have gone into effect is putting in our own gauges in locations where we're able to do so. We have a limited number of gauges, and so we've been working to try and put those out in some key locations and get those rated and calibrated and giving us data. That is an ongoing area of difficulty due to resource challenges that we have and the fact that we are far away. So in some instances, we've contracted with the water master to try and help us with those gauges. But if folks have a location that they think is good and we think we can put a gauge in that location to gather some information in the nearer term, we're happy to have conversations and look at getting those in. Those, of course, are smaller gauges, so they're going to go in and typically not be in for the full year because they're, you know, not well equipped to be there year round. But I do think what we need in the longer term is folks in the community or groups in the community that are well trained in how to rate these gauges so that everybody can have a high confidence level in the data that's being produced. We've heard from some folks, they don't trust that gauge because, you know, it hasn't given good data. So to the extent that the community can get better training on how to rate and oversee these gauges, and all of that information can be put in one key location. You know, we talk about this with the community in the subgroup meetings and also with the regional board. So I think in the longer term, that's where we need to go if we want to be able to have other locations and feel confident about using gauges throughout the watershed.
Yeah, I really appreciate that last point. I know that was part of our discussion when we were adopting the resolution around the long-term effort here in the watershed, but really needing to have a place where all of this is synthesized into one place. So no matter if the gauge is, you know, funded by DWR or the state board or, you know, from Farm Bureau or for someone local property owner, the ability really to aggregate and all of us collectively better be able to have a basis for information in one place, I think is going to be really important. So I'll just flag it something that I'll be looking to make sure that to the extent that, and I know it's a resource constraint and it's also sort of an ownership constraint. Where does it live? How is it maintained? But developing that platform over the course of the next year, I think is going to be really important to kind of continue to move us in the right direction in these discussions. So thank you. Really appreciate those responses, Ms. Bergazzi. Looking to fellow board colleagues if they have some questions, comments. Board Member Firestone.
Thanks. And I had the same question, so that was really helpful discussion. And just, you know, I'll echo the thanks to staff and stakeholders that have been working on this and constructively engaging. And I think we all just echo the, you know, I think we all agree that we need more permanent regulatory frameworks as instead of having to rely on emergency. I think that's not ideal, not the way that I want to see us have to do things. And so I'm look forward to the work over the next couple years, but appreciate all the discussion on that, including the discussion on, you know, how we're navigating this challenge around fiscal impacts. And, you know, this is not unique to this area. There's, you know, certainly I think that the overall challenge of how do you capture and how do we fit in the context of the costs of not taking action, in addition to the costs of what our actions may have. And that's a challenge that we need to continue to navigate is how to do that well. Let's see, question I have is one, Mr. Webb mentioned, one of the comments that he mentioned was around constraints on, I think it was Department of Fish and Game or Fish and Wildlife, on investigations. And I just was wondering if staff could clarify that issue.
Yes, so in the change sheet, I think that the item that Mr. Webb was referring to is there's a sentence that says if such, so this is the provision that provides for alternative flows in the Shasta River during the summer if CDFW recommends evaluation of those alternative flows. And it provides for evaluation of flows that are lower than those established in the emergency regulation upon CDFW recommendation. But if the alternative flows are higher than the flows that are in the regulation, the proposal requires agreement by the affected right holders. Recognizing without that, they're sort of being impacted by something that's not being adopted by the board directly today. And so that provides the ability to have those conversations and have that notice. So that's the provision that he's referring to. It requires an additional step of getting support from those that would be affected by such increased flows.
So, and well, I guess I want to come back to that, but I think in particular, one of the things he mentioned was constraints on investigations too. And so
I think that's a misunderstanding of the reading of the regulation.
Okay. Okay. Well, so one the overall issue that you highlighted around which water was one of the comments overall was around which water right holders need to provide consent. And so I'm wondering if we feel like we need to clarify that. In other words, how are we defining affected water rights holders?
So that would be, and Mariana can jump in if I get this wrong or don't say it clearly enough, but so if we're looking at higher flows and the flow throughout the summer is 50 CFS, let's say that the evaluation of alternative flows is going to be 70 CFS. So there's 20 CFS increase in flows that's needed. Depending on where curtailments were in place at that point in time, we would have to identify who would be affected by going from 50 to 70. And those would be the affected water rights holders. And we can't determine that until we are in the moment and understand what flows are currently, who's currently curtailed, and who might be impacted. It may be one large water user, or it could be a variable amount of water users, depending on the status of curtailments at that point in time, or if there are no curtailments in place at that time.
I think those are my questions. Maybe just overall comments are, I am really concerned about the potential trading of information for flow precedent. I'm just wanting to make sure it's not kind of undermining the whole intent. I get why, what the particular example and benefit is, but I think I want to just flag here that as we move forward with looking at permanent and any need to readopt in the future, I am really concerned about this as a precedent and a framework. So I would really want to just make sure we understand how this is working and continue to refine. I think that overall for the last 4 years, there's been a lot of refinement and learning and continued evolution of our regulatory program. So I have faith that that will continue on this. I also want to relatedly, and I know Board Member Morgan mentioned the issue of buffer. I think we're all concerned about how, especially in the Scott, I think even more than, as staff said, more than the Shasta, where there's a little more potential for making things up if we go under. This is a minimum. Dipping below the minimum is not meeting that, and we need to figure out how we're going to manage, how we build that into the framework. I thought the idea of looking at the amounts where it dipped below as a potential block of water. But there, I think we just need to, how do we, staff are approaching this through looking at buffers. I think that's just a real challenge, and I really look forward to seeing how stakeholders come to the table with ideas and suggestions and help us work through how to do this, because it's, I think, particularly in Scott, a real challenge and one that I'm really concerned about going under. Because this really is, because the framework that we're using here really is minimum for an, incredibly endangered species. I mean, the numbers, especially for coho and, for all the species listed, are really scary and sobering. And so I just take that really seriously. I think those were my, in general, I also don't, I think that we all do better when the more transparent information, the better. So I would, on my own, hope that there would be more sharing of information around local cooperative solutions with local stakeholders as well, just to help build trust and understanding of things. So I think that's an unfortunate dynamic right now. I hope that we can get to a place where that's, as a matter of policy, I don't think that withholding information, location information is helpful for building trust, but I think I'm comfortable with where things are in this draft at this point, and I just hope we can continue to improve that and those dynamics as things go forward. Thanks.
You're here. Thank you, board member. Vice Chair Diademo.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for their constructive comments, and again, just want to reiterate that but for some of these additional provisions that provide for flexibility, I would probably be more at my limit of saying, this would be time to either pause or wait and see how the year goes. But I'm hopeful that with these additional provisions that provide for flexibility, we can help continue to move the conversation forward as we shift over into the permanent regulations. And so having said that, I'm interested in looking into an appropriate check-in period, because I'd be interested in hearing an update on gauges, buffer, bringing things in as tight as possible. I think that staff is, getting better with each year, and so are the stakeholders. And, just want to hear about how that communication is going, as well as local cooperative solutions updates and the piece on the Shasta for some alternative approach and testing, as well as getting an update on a timeline for the permanent regulations.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I second your request here that we do an informational item sometime here in these next months, looking to, I don't know if there's a sense from folks, Ms. Ragazzi, if when that might be, but just as a thought, it would be helpful to hear some update on the Shasta and any sort of flexibility or testing that's going to go on into the summer before it necessarily happens. So maybe it's just as we start to get into the summer season or not. Again, I'll depend on your expertise on when the timing might be, but I think it would be good to make sure we circle back and just hear how things are going, where conversations are around some of the flexibility that's been envisioned, especially for the Shasta.
I'd want to coordinate with my team, but off the cuff, probably late May or early June, because at that point in time, we will have gotten through the local cooperative solutions submittal period and have a little bit more information on that side of things. And we'll be able to hopefully bring CDFW back to talk about how conversations in the Shasta are going and have any updates relative to that piece of the puzzle as well.
Great, thank you for that small preview. And again, thank you, Vice Chair. I agree. I think it'd be good to make sure we're checking in given the dynamic nature of the discussions that we're all amidst. Looking to fellow board colleagues if there's further. Board Member McGuire.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think most of the questions were already asked and appreciate those being raised as flags. I think for me, well, one thing I wanted to highlight is when it comes to the economic analysis, the impact analysis, if you will, right? I really appreciate the comments that were provided by a number of folks today, and I agree. It's more in line of a cost benefit analysis, to be a little bit crude there, but it's really looking at what are the benefits of the flows in terms of what they provide, not only for the ecosystem, the environment, for the fishery, but also for the fishing industry and those activities that go around utilizing that resource. And on the flip side, it's that balancing with the trade-offs that we look at when directing more resources that are currently used for other purposes to that same river and watershed and what that means. And so, yes, this is certainly not a unique question. It comes up every single time, but this is in every watershed that we look at. And it's challenging. There's a reason it's so hard to answer that question, but that's the job that the board has when weighing the public trust, when looking at that balancing responsibility. Some of it's economic, some of it's more intrinsic, and some of it's more being stewards for the environment here, and those that can't represent themselves. But all those factors have to weigh into our decisions. And so it gets hard here when we come year after year after year with the same emergency regulation. And every year I do feel the same urgency that we need to act, we need to protect these fisheries, that we need to do something, that we shouldn't allow for dry river conditions here. And so that's persuasive to me. But at the same time, and we need to be continuing to learn and adapt and grow and be flexible and mindful that this is a really complicated system. The Klamath, just hearing the 6,000 fish going up the Klamath this year alone, I mean, that's huge. That's bigger than a lot of the numbers that we're seeing here in the Scott and Shasta. So things are changing. And so adaptation is going to be a part of this solution, even in the short term as well as the long term. So for me, it's the flexibility that's built in with the local cooperative solutions, being open to potential experimentation and pilot efforts in the Shasta, elsewhere perhaps. I think just being receptive to those conversations is a way that I have optimism that we can build some collaboration for the longer term. And in that spirit, I think thinking back to the governor's executive order that declared the drought in the first place, really implored us all to try and work together for collaborative solutions first and foremost before we went to an emergency regulation. And so now, we're here, and I'm comfortable moving forward today. But I think it's with that understanding that there's still opportunity for collaboration and working together within the kind of confines of this emergency regulation as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, and I appreciate the changes that have been made and also the comments that were provided today. They're very helpful. And I'd be happy to make a motion whenever ready.
Yep, thank you, board member. I saw a couple of hands up on the platform. We usually don't circle back to commenters, but if Mr. Webb, you want to make a quick point, we can hear it.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I just wanted to clarify what Mrs. Firestone was asking about. When you read the change sheet, it basically says that the Department of Fish and Game is free to investigate lower flows than the minimums proposed in the draft proposal. But to investigate higher flows, they have to ask permission from the very people from whom those higher flows will come. And that's not likely to ever occur. It's like asking someone in jail if they would like their term to be extended so they spend more time in jail. Just not going to happen. So what I suggested might be a compromise would be that there are numerous instances when flows in the river fall below your minimum. And that water cannot be recovered directly. It's gone. It's been diverted and used for agriculture. But that could be accounted for as a volume, which could then be used for investigating the impact of higher in-stream flows without having a net reduction in flows beyond what your minimum flows call for. So I think it's a reasonable way to reduce the current incentives to sort of game the system by making the minimum a target instead of a minimum. And it would give the Department of Fish and Game the potential to investigate some slightly higher flows that they otherwise effectively do not have. Thank you.
Thanks for the clarification, Mr. Webb. I appreciate the comment. Okay, looking to fellow board colleagues again. There isn't further comment or question. I think we may be ready for a motion.
And I said I was prepared and I was wrong. Okay, I will move to adopt the resolution under item 4 with the change sheet number 1 that was circulated earlier.
Thank you, board member. Do we have a second?
I'll second the motion and just want to thank everyone for the comments today and staff for their continued work on this item.
Thank you both. Ms. Tyler, can you please call a roll call vote?
Board Member McGuire,
Aye.
Board Member Morgan,
Aye.
Board Member Firestone,
Aye.
Vice Chair Diadamo,
Aye.
and Chair Esquivel.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. The item is adopted, and just an incredible amount of appreciation to everyone in their work on this, and look forward to what I know will be a lot more discussion here in the year ahead. And so just thank you, and the item is adopted. With that, unceremoniously, we now move on to board member reports and our tranche of informational items here. Looking to fellow board colleagues, if they have anything they'd like to share, as I quickly try to bring up my own calendar and see.
I have nothing to report.
I have nothing to report.
I have nothing to report.
I have nothing to report except for a happy new year to everyone. Looking forward to 2025. 2024 was a great year. That wraps up item number 5 and brings us to item number 6, our executive director's report. Mr. Oppenheimer, anything you'd like to report or highlight within your very extensive, as always, and filled with incredibly good information executive director report?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to mention that the Office of
You might want to bring your mic closer. Sorry.
Is that better?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great. I just wanted to mention that the Office of Public Engagement, Equity, and Tribal Affairs, the newly minted name for that office, reports in the executive director's report quarterly, and this month they have a report. Their quarterly report is included. It's pretty substantial, and anyone who's interested in getting a flavor of what they've been up to, I recommend you take a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, and really appreciate the reorganization there, the added emphasis to our engagement with communities, disadvantaged and otherwise, but importantly tribes as well. So just thank you. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's agenda, but it does not bring us to the end of our meeting. We will be transitioning to closed session. First, a discussion on the Delta Conveyance Project that will be followed up by a Title VI discussion. And we will then move into closed session. Let's give ourselves 15 minutes for lunch. So if we meet at 1 o'clock, does that sound about right? Okay, so yeah, 1 o'clock. We'll meet at 1 o'clock in room 2510.
2510, correct.
And until then, we'll get closed out here officially at the very end. But until then, thank you for everyone for your participation in this board meeting. Our next board meeting will be Wednesday, January 22nd, and look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you. Be safe, be well, and again, Happy New Year. Thanks all.